Hey there, and welcome back. Settle yourself down now, wherever you happen to be, and let the day loosen its hold on you a little at a time. This is one of those slow evenings made for going a long way back, for lying still beneath the blankets, while somebody else keeps watch over the passing hours. It is for you, the one who has had a full day, or perhaps an empty one, and who would like now only to be told a story until sleep comes quietly to fetch you. So let me take you somewhere far off, into a country of sun and stone and old bells, and into the life of a woman who was carried out of that country while she was still a child. There is nothing you need to do now but rest, and let the telling carry you along. We are going back more than 800 years, to a girl of 12 who was lifted onto a horse by the most famous old woman in all of Christendom, and taken north over the mountains to be married into a kingdom she had never once set eyes upon. Before we go down into it, I want to say one small thing, and then I will not interrupt the story again. The woman we are going to spend this evening with is one the histories have half forgotten. She was a queen who twice held a whole kingdom together with her own two hands, and who is remembered now when she is remembered at all, mostly as somebody's mother. If you find that these long, unhurried evenings are a kind of company you would like to keep, you are always welcome to subscribe, so that whenever a new one is ready, it can find its way quietly to you. There is no hurry in any of it, and nothing that you must do. It is only there if you would like it. The way a lamp is left burning in a window for anyone who might be passing in the cold. And now I will let the story have you. Picture this: a high, dry country in the middle of Spain in the last years of the 12th century. The land lies open and pale under an enormous sky. A tableland, the colour of dust and bone, where the wind comes off the plain with nothing to stop it, and the churches stand square and heavy as if braced against the light. This is Castile. It is a young kingdom, hard and proud, forever looking south toward the frontier, where the lands of the Christian kings press up against the lands of the Moors, and where a boy is raised, knowing that a horse and a sword may be asked of him before he is grown. In a palace of thick walls and small deep windows, built to keep the sun out rather than to let it in, a girl is born in the springtime of the year 1188. Her name is Blanca. In the seasons to come, the French will soften it on their own tongues and call her Blanche, and it is by that name that the world will remember her. But here, at the beginning, she is a Spanish child in a Spanish court, and the frontier is not so very far away. Let yourself stand for a while inside that court, for it is a world worth feeling on the skin before we go on. The palace is a place of thick walls and shaded rooms, built by people who have learned to treat the sun as an adversary through the lengthy parched months, and a friend only in the brief chill of the turning season. The floors are of stone and of glazed tile, laid in patterns that carry a memory of the craftsmen of the south, of the Moorish artisans whose skill has soaked into the very fabric of Spanish building, whether the Christian kings will own it or not. In the courtyards there is the plash of water, for water is precious here, and a fountain is a form of wealth, and its trickle in a shaded corner is among the first sounds the child would ever have known. Beyond the walls lies the great tableland, the meseta, reaching away level and pale to a horizon that trembles in the heat, dotted with the flocks whose wool is the making of the kingdom's fortune, crossed by the tracks along which the drovers move their animals with the changing of the pasture. And over all of it hang the bells of the churches, telling the hours, calling the faithful, and beneath the bells always, the low awareness that somewhere to the south, the land of the Christians gives way to the land of the Moors, and that a border is a matter that must be guarded. It is a hard, proud, devout, and warlike world, and the child takes it in without knowing that she does so, the way any child absorbs the only home it has. She learns the taste of the food of her country, the oil and the bread and the flesh of the flocks and the wine of the hillsides. She learns the pattern of the church that shapes every royal day, The office sung in the chill before first light, the hours spaced across the round of the sun, the great feasts breaking the ordinary rhythm with colour and music and the smell of resin and beeswax. She learns, without any tutor setting it before her as a lesson, that she belongs to a family whose whole reason for being is to rule and to fight and to hold the faith against its enemies, and that a princess is a piece in that great enterprise to be spent for the good of the house. All of this goes into the making of her, down where the earliest years lodge and are never afterward dislodged, and it will still be in her half a century later and many hundreds of miles away, when she governs a foreign country as though she had been born to its throne. Her father is the sovereign, Alfonso, the eighth of that name, a serious and capable man who has spent his life holding his kingdom against its enemies and enlarging it where he can. Her mother is a queen brought over from another country, a daughter of the royal house of England, and it is through this mother that a long thread runs backward out of Castile and across the sea. A thread that will matter more to this child than anyone yet knows. For the girl's grandmother, her mother's own mother, is a woman whose name is spoken in every court from the edge of Scotland to the shores of the Mediterranean. But that is a thread to be drawn out later. For now the child is only one daughter among a vast crowd of royal children, and by no means the one anybody expects to make a mark upon the world. She grows up in the ordinary, extraordinary way of a princess of her time. There are nurses and there are chaplains. There are the long offices of the church marking out the shape of each day. And there are lessons. For this is a learned court, and a girl of her rank is taught to read her psalter and to carry herself, to understand something of the business of kingship, even if she is never expected to wield it. She learns the smell of her country by heart, without ever meaning to, the resin of the pine, the dust after the rare rain, the incense in the cold naves, the leather and horse sweat of the great courtyard where the men mount up. She learns the sound of many languages passing through a frontier court, and she is one of a company of sisters, girls close in age, who share a chamber and a childhood, who will be parcelled out one by one to the thrones of Christendom as the treaties require. For that is what princesses are for, and every one of them knows it. It is worth dwelling for a moment on that company of sisters, because it tells us something about the world Blanche came from and the strange lottery of her entire future. Her mother and father were a fruitful pair, and the nursery of the Castilian court was crowded with royal children, daughters chief among them, each one a card to be played in the great game of alliances that was the true trade of kings. One sister would go to be queen of a neighbouring Spanish kingdom, another to another. The marriages laid out on the board like moves in a game whose stakes were provinces and peace. To be born a daughter of such a house was to know, from as far back as memory reached, that your marriage was not yours to give, but the kingdom's, that some day a man you had never met would be chosen for you in a room where you were not present, and that you would be sent away, perhaps very far away, to bind your father's house to his. The girls grew up in that knowledge together, and it must have shaped the way they held one another. Close in the shared chamber of their childhood, and yet each aware that the day was coming when they would be scattered to the winds of policy and would very likely never all be in one room again. And into this crowded, watchful, ordinary world of a princess's upbringing there was about to fall the most extraordinary visitor. A summons out of the north that would single out one of these girls from all the rest, and set her upon a road that none of them could have imagined. For while Blanche went about the small business of her days, learning her letters and her prayers and her needle, matters were moving far away that would reach down into the nursery and lift her out of it. And the hand that would do the lifting belonged to the one member of the family whose fame outshone even her father, the monarch's. Above all of them, unseen but always present, hangs the question of marriage. It hangs over every royal girl like weather. Somewhere, far away, kings and their councillors are drawing lines on the map of Europe, and the daughters of Castile are among the pieces to be moved. The child cannot know that a peace is being stitched together between two great and quarrelsome kingdoms far to the north, and that the price of that peace, the seal upon it, is to be a marriage, and that the bride is to be fetched from this very court. She cannot know that her own grandmother, old now beyond the age when most people are laid in the ground, is even at this moment thinking of her. That is exactly where we are going next. For the peace being made was between the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of England, and it needed a girl of Castile to hold it shut. The two crowns had been at each other's throats for a generation, quarrelling over the great sprawl of French lands that the English kings held on the far side of the sea. Now, for a season at least, they wished to rest, and the surest medieval way to bind two houses that had been enemies was to marry them together, to make of the next generation a single blood, so that a man might think twice before making war upon his own grandchildren. So it was agreed. A daughter of Castile, a granddaughter of the old English queen, would be given to the heir of France. And there was only one person in all the world whom the aging King of England trusted to go and fetch her. That person was his mother, and she was the most remarkable woman of the age. Her name was Eleanor, and she had been born to the great duchy of Aquitaine in the warm south of France. In the long course of her life, she had been Queen of France by her first marriage, and then Queen of England by her second, had gone on crusade to the Holy Land, had borne a double handful of children, and seen her sons crowned and her sons rebel, had been shut up in captivity for years by a husband who feared her, and had outlived very nearly everyone who had ever crossed her. Now she was close upon 80, an age that in that century was almost beyond counting, and she might have been forgiven for keeping to her chair by the fire. Instead, when the peace required a bride to be brought over the mountains from Spain, it was Eleanor who rose and called for her people and set out upon the road. She would choose the girl herself. She would trust the matter to no one else. Think of that journey, for it is worth pausing over. An old woman, the grandmother of half the crowned heads of Europe, travelling in the last stretch of the 12-month across the width of France and up into the passes of the Pyrenees as the cold came on. The mountains in that season are no gentle thing. The roads are narrow and stony and climb into thin blue air. The passes are swept with wind, and a litter carried between mules sways sickeningly over drops that fall away into nothing. She was jolted and frozen and slowed by every kind of difficulty, and she did not turn back. She had spent her whole life crossing distances that would have broken other people, and she was not going to be stopped now on this last errand by a few mountains and her own great age. Somewhere ahead of her, in a palace on the dusty plain, a crowd of her granddaughters were waiting to be looked over, and one of them was going to be chosen for a throne. That was the errand. The rest of Europe held its breath and let the old queen do as she pleased, because by now they all knew better than to argue with her. To understand why so much was left in the hands of one aged woman, you have to understand what Eleanor of Aquitaine had been. She had come into the world the heiress of the richest and most cultured duchy in France, a land of troubadours and warm sun and easy wealth, and she had been married while still a girl to the sovereign of France, and had been his queen for years before the marriage was dissolved and she was free again. Then, within a matter of weeks, she had married the man who would become King of England, a younger and fiercer husband, and had become queen of a second kingdom, and had borne him a great brood of sons and daughters, and had watched those sons grow into famous and quarrelsome men, one of them the very Crusader king whose name was spoken with awe from one end of Christendom to the other. She had ruled, she had schemed, she had raised her sons in rebellion against their own father, and been shut away for it in long stretches of captivity. And she had outlived the husband who imprisoned her, and come out the other side to govern again in her old age with all her wits about her. There was, quite simply, no one else like her alive. Kings and popes had learned across 60 years that this was a woman whose judgment was not lightly overruled. And now, at the very end, she was spending the last of her formidable strength on this one last piece of family business: the fetching of a granddaughter to be a queen. There is something almost unbearably poignant in the picture, once you let yourself hold it. The greatest woman of her age, who had been at the centre of everything for so long, making one final journey to the edge of the known world to reach down into a nursery and choose the child who would carry her blood and her steel into the next generation. She could not know, as she jolted over the passes in the cold, that the girl she was going to choose would grow into a ruler worthy of her. A queen who would face dangers as great as any Eleanor had faced and meet them with the same unbending nerve. But perhaps some part of her hoped for exactly that. Perhaps the entire point of making the journey herself, rather than sending some bishop or baron to do it, was that only she could recognize, in the face of a quiet child, the matter she was looking for. And so the old queen came down at last, out of the high country and onto the plain, and the towers of the Castilian court rose up before her out of the haze. Word ran ahead of her, as word always does, and the whole household turned out to receive her. Imagine the scene from the point of view of the children, the granddaughters lined up and scrubbed and dressed in their best, told to stand straight and to hold their tongues and to make their reverence when the moment came. They had heard of this grandmother all their lives. She was a story to them, a legend out of the north, the woman who had been the wife of 2 kings and the mother of the lion-hearted crusader, whose fame had reached even here. And now the legend herself was climbing stiffly down from her litter in the courtyard, an old woman wrapped against the cold, her face lined by 80 years of a life lived at the very centre of the world, her eyes, by every account, still perfectly sharp. She had not come all this way for ceremony, though there was ceremony enough. She had come to look at the girls. And here we arrive at one of those moments that a life turns upon. A moment so quiet that no one present could have known its weight, and yet everything that follows hangs from it. That is exactly where we are going next. To a decision made in an afternoon that would shape the destiny of France for half a century. For the treaty, when it was drawn up, had not named which daughter of Castile was to go north. It had said only that a daughter would be given. The choosing was left open, and the choosing was given to Eleanor. Now, by the plain custom of the age, there was an obvious answer already waiting. The eldest unmarried sister should go first. Her name was Urraca, and by every ordinary expectation, she was the one who would be packed up and sent to France to be a queen. She had been raised, very likely, half expecting it. The younger girls, Blanche among them, might have supposed they would be kept back for other matches, other kingdoms, whatever the years should require. But Eleanor of Aquitaine had not crossed the mountains at the end of her life in order to do the obvious thing. She looked at her granddaughters, all of them, and she thought not as a mother thinks of which daughter is next in line, but as a stateswoman thinks of which girl will make the better queen in a hard country far from home, and her eye settled not upon the elder sister, but upon the younger. It settled upon Blanche. We should let ourselves feel how strange and how large that moment was, though no one who stood in the room could have measured it at the time. Here were the daughters of the house, brought out and arranged before the awesome old visitor, each of them wondering, surely, what the grandmother from the north had come for, and which of them it might concern. By every rule and expectation, the matter was already settled before it began, for the elder unmarried girl was the natural choice, and there is no reason to think that anyone present, least of all the 2 sisters, most nearly touched by it, imagined that the older would be passed over. And yet as the old queen looked from face to face, weighing what only she could weigh, the whole future of a kingdom was turning on the hinge of her private judgment. To the sister who was expected to be chosen, it must have seemed a settled thing, her destiny already half in hand. To the younger, standing a little back perhaps, it can hardly have crossed her mind that the searching gaze would come to rest on her. And then it did, and everything tilted. In the quiet of a single afternoon, without a battle or a treaty or a word spoken in anger, the course of two young lives was swapped about, and the girl who had expected a French throne did not have it. And the girl who had expected nothing of the kind was suddenly the chosen one, the future queen, the bearer of the peace between two mighty kingdoms. We are not told how the sisters took it, and it is one of those human silences in the record that we can only stand before and wonder at. But it is hard not to think of the two of them afterward. The one quietly set aside, and the other quietly lifted up, and of how little either of them had to do with the turning of their own fates, and of how the whole of it rested in the failing eyes of an old woman who had seen more of the world than either of them ever would. Why she chose as she did, we cannot now say with any certainty, and it is right to be honest about that, because so much confident nonsense has been written about the minds of people 8 centuries dead. The story that came to be told, and that has been repeated ever since, is a charming one, and it may even be true, though we should hold it lightly. It was said that the trouble was the name. Urraca is a fine and ancient Spanish name, but it is a difficult one, for a French mouth, full of sounds that the northern tongue does not like, and it was thought, so the tale goes, that the people of France would stumble over it and never take their new queen to their hearts. Blanche, on the other hand, was one that France already knew and could say with ease and even with affection, for it means white, it means fair, and it fell pleasantly on every ear. And so, if the story is to be believed, a girl's whole life was turned upon the sound of her own name. Perhaps that is the truth of it, or perhaps it is only the neat explanation that later people reached for, the way we always reach for a tidy reason when the real ones are lost. It may be that Eleanor simply looked at the two girls and judged, in the way that a very old and very experienced person can sometimes judge a child, that this younger one had in her the steadiness, the seriousness, the deep reserve of will that a queen would need. Blanche was not, by all that we can gather, a merry or a giddy child. She was grave beyond her years, careful, watchful, already marked by that gravity which would define her entire long life. An old woman who had spent 80 years reading the characters of the powerful might well have seen, in a quiet girl of 11, the makings of the formidable queen she would become. We cannot know. What we know is the choice. Eleanor chose Blanche, and with that, the child's life changed utterly and forever. In the space of a single conversation between the grown people over her head. She was to leave Castile. She was to leave her father and her mother, and the whole company of her sisters, and the only country she had ever known. The dust and the pines and the square heavy churches, and she was never truly to return. She was to be taken north, over the very mountains the old queen had just crossed, into France, and there she was to be married to a boy she had never met, and to become in time the queen of a foreign land. She was 12 years old. There is no record of what she felt, standing in that courtyard while her fate was settled, and we should not pretend to know it. But we may allow ourselves to imagine the strange, cold largeness of it. For a child to be told that she is chosen, that she is fortunate beyond her sisters, and that the price of the fortune is everything and everyone she has ever loved. There was little time given for grief, and little for preparation. These matters, once decided, moved with the slow inevitability of the season, and yet somehow always in a hurry at the end. A household had to be got together to travel with her, women to attend her, and clergy to instruct her, and men-at-arms to guard the road, and gifts and goods, and the entire apparatus that must accompany a princess across a continent. Eleanor, having made her choice, did not linger long in Castile. She was old and the cold was deepening, and the way home was long, and she would herself conduct the girl at least part of the journey. So the two of them set out together, the woman at the very end of her extraordinary life, and the child at the very beginning of hers, bound north out of Spain. the one going home to die within a few years, and the other going to a country she would rule. Spare a thought for that pairing on the road, for there is something in it that stays with you. The most famous woman of the 12th century, who had done everything a woman of her time could conceivably do, and a great deal that no one of her sex was supposed to do at all. Riding the last long road of her life beside a solemn Spanish girl who did not yet know that she was being handed, in a sense, the future. It is tempting to imagine the old queen speaking to the child along the way, telling her something of what a soul might do with power if she were clever and patient and unafraid. Though of course we have no record of any such thing, and it is only a pleasing fancy. What we can say is that the seed of the person Blanche would become was in her already, whatever her grandmother did or did not say, and that the years ahead would water it. For she would grow into a queen every bit as formidable as Eleanor of Aquitaine, and in some ways more so. But all of that was still to come. First, there was the lengthy journey, and at the end of it, a wedding. And the wedding, when they reached it, would prove to be a very strange one. Indeed, the road out of Castile and into France was not a matter of a few days, but of many weeks. A slow, grinding progress across the whole width of two countries, at the pace of laden mules and walking men. They went up through the passes and down into the green rolling country of the south of France, Eleanor's own Duchy of Aquitaine, where the light softened and the vines climbed the hillsides and the air smelled of a wetter, kinder land than the one the girl had left behind. Somewhere along that road, the old queen and her granddaughter parted, for Eleanor could go no further and had her own affairs to settle before the end. And the child went on without her, into the north, toward the meeting that had been arranged. It was the last the two of them would see of each other. Within a few years, the old woman would be dead, laid to rest in the abbey she loved, and the girl she had chosen would be a wife and soon a mother. And the thread that ran back through the generations would have passed entirely into the younger hands. Try to feel the length and the strangeness of that road as the child would have felt it. Week upon week of travel, at the slow pace of a vast household on the move, the mules and the wagons and the walking men, the baggage of a princess and the guards to keep it safe, winding north across all the breadth of a continent. Every league took her further from the only country she had ever known, and deeper into a strangeness that grew about her by degrees. The food a little different at each halt. The speech in the villages sliding by imperceptible steps out of the tongue of her childhood and into the tongues of the north. She would have watched the very land change through the curtains of her litter, the pale burning plains of Castile giving way to the green folded hills of the French south, and then to the flatter, wetter, greyer country beyond, where the light itself was of another kind, softer and more veiled, falling through cloud rather than blazing out of a hard blue sky. For a girl who had never in her life been out of the sun of Spain, the north must have seemed almost another world, damp and dim and close, and she was riding into it to live there for the rest of her days. And she was riding into it, remember, to be married to a boy she had never met, in a country whose language she barely had, among people who would look at her as a foreigner and weigh her and find much to whisper about. Whatever fear or grief or bewilderment moved in her on that long road, she kept to herself, as she would keep so much to herself all her life. And by the time she came at last to the end of it, she had schooled her face into the composure that would become her armour. But we may allow ourselves, at least, to imagine the child behind the composure, small in the great swaying litter, carried mile by mile away from her mother and her sisters and her home, toward a wedding that was not even to be held in the country she was marrying into, for reasons that had nothing to do with her and that must have seemed, to a girl of 12, as arbitrary and enormous as the weather. Now a royal wedding in that century was ordinarily a thing of enormous public splendour, staged in a great cathedral before the assembled nobility of a kingdom, with the bells of the capital ringing and crowds in the streets and every possible show of glory. because the entire point of it was to be seen, to announce to the world that two houses were joined and a peace was sealed. Blanche's wedding was nothing of the kind, and the reason for that is one of the odder corners of her story. The kingdom of France, into which she was marrying, lay at that very moment under a punishment from the Pope, a matter called an interdict, which is worth explaining because it hangs strangely over the beginning of her married life. The trouble was the private life of the man who was to become her father in the eyes of the law, the King of France himself, Philip, the second of that name, called Augustus, a hard, cunning, patient man who was in the slow business of making France into a real and unified kingdom. Some years before, Philip had married a princess of Denmark named Ingeborg, and then, for reasons that were never fully explained and were probably no better than distaste, he had turned against her the very day after the wedding and tried by every means to be rid of her. He locked her away, he badgered his bishops to declare the marriage void, and he took another woman in her place. But Ingeborg would not go quietly, and she appealed to Rome, and the Pope, who was a strong one, took her part. When Philip would not give way, the Pope reached for the heaviest weapon he had. He laid the whole kingdom of France under interdict. And an interdict was a terrible thing, for it did not fall upon the guilty king alone, but upon every soul in his lands. Under an interdict, the churches fell silent. The bells did not ring. The dead could not be buried in holy ground with the proper rites. Children could not be baptized in the ordinary way, and the great festivals passed unmarked. A whole people was made to suffer in its soul until its king should submit. So it was that, when the daughter of Castile arrived to be married into France, France itself was a forbidden ground for a sacrament. A wedding could not be celebrated there, and the solution the two sides hit upon carries a certain quiet strangeness. They would hold the wedding just outside the borders of the interdicted kingdom, on land that belonged not to the monarch of France, but to the sovereign of England. For remember that the entire purpose of this marriage was to bind France and England together, and the English king held wide territories in the north of France, in Normandy, which lay under no papal ban. And so the bride was brought to a place called Port-Mort in Normandy, on English-held ground, and it was there, in the spring of the year 1200, that the girl of 12 was married. The details of the exact spot and the precise reasons have come down to us a little tangled, as such things do, and it is fair to hold the finer points loosely. But the broad, strange shape of it is clear enough. She was married on borrowed ground in a corner of one kingdom to bind together two others, because the land she was marrying into was for the moment forbidden to God's grace. The boy she was married to was called Louis. He was the heir of France, the only surviving son of King Philip, and he was 13, a year older than his bride. History would come to know him as Louis VIII, and to give him the name of the Lion, though that was all far off, and on his wedding day he was only a slight and serious boy, as gravely brought up as she had been, marrying a foreign girl he had never met, because the treaty said that he must. There was no love in the arranging of it, and there could be none yet, for they were strangers and children both. But it is one of the gentler surprises of this whole story that love did come in time, and that these two children, married for reasons of state, grew into a devoted and genuinely affectionate couple, which was far more than most royal marriages of the age could claim, and far more than either of them had any right to expect. That, though, was the work of years. On the day itself, they were only two grave children joined before a priest on a patch of Norman ground, while somewhere to the south, a whole kingdom sat under its punishment and waited for its bells to ring again. And then, the wedding done, the girl went at last into France to take up the life that had been chosen for her, and here begins one of the harder passages of her early years. For it is one thing to be married to a country, and quite another to be accepted by it. She came into the court of her father-in-law, the court of Philip Augustus, and it was a court unlike anything she had known. Where Castile had been all frontier hardness and open sky, this was the cool green heart of the north, a land of slow rivers and grey stone, and a different quality of light altogether. The centre of it was the city of Paris, and the centre of Paris was an island in the river, a crowded island of churches, and the old royal palace, where the business of the growing kingdom was done. To this Blanche came, a Spanish girl of 12, with an accent on her tongue, and the manners of another country in her bones, to be watched and weighed by the people who would one day be her subjects. It cannot have been easy, and we should not pretend that it was. She was a foreigner, and in every age a foreign bride at a proud court is an object of suspicion until she proves herself, and sometimes long after. Her Spanish ways would have marked her out. Her very name, chosen though it was for its ease on French tongues, could not save her from being the stranger, the girl from over the mountains, brought in to seal a bargain. And her father-in-law, King Philip, was not a warm man. He was clever and cold and endlessly calculating, the architect of a France that was steadily swallowing the lands of its rivals, and he did not deal in tenderness. Nor was his household a happy one, shadowed as it was by the long grim quarrel over the queen he had cast aside, the wronged Ingeborg still appealing to Rome, still refusing to disappear, a living reproach in the middle of the royal family. Into this cool, watchful, unhappy court came the girl who would one day master it, and at first she was nobody in it at all, only the young wife of the heir, expected to be quiet, to learn the language, to learn the country, and above all, in the fullness of time, to give it sons. Let the city itself come up around her for a moment, for it was to be the great stage of the rest of her life. Paris in that season was not yet the vast capital it would become, but it was growing fast, spilling out along both banks of its river and clustered most thickly upon the island at its heart, where the old palace of the kings stood among the churches and the narrow crowded lanes. The river was the life of the place, brown and busy, crossed by wooden bridges lined with houses and shops, carrying the barges that brought grain and wine and timber down to the wharves. The smell of it would have been the smell of any medieval town, wood smoke and river mud and the press of people and animals, threaded through with the incense that drifted from 100 church doors. For Paris was a city of churches, its skyline a thicket of towers and spires, its hours measured out by an endless overlapping of bells. To a girl raised under the hard, clear light of Castile, the north must have felt shut in and grey, its winters longer and its skies lower, its damp creeping into the stone. But it was hers now, and she set about learning it as she learned everything, thoroughly, patiently, giving nothing away, and she learned too the man at the centre of it, her father in the eyes of the law. And though she could not have loved the cold old king, she studied him, and what she saw was a master at work. Philip Augustus governed France the way a careful merchant tends an immense business, forever adding, consolidating, tightening his grip, turning the loose feudal kingdom he had inherited into something more like a state, with its officers and its records and its steady reach. He had wrested the richest of the English lands away from Blanche's own uncle and folded them into the crown. He trusted almost no one, and forgave almost nothing, and missed almost nothing, and a watchful young woman, with a mind of her own, could learn a great deal from such a man about how power is truly held. Not by grand gestures, but by patience, attention, and an unsleeping care for detail. Blanche was that watchful young woman, and the lessons of Philip's court went as deep into her as the lessons of her Castilian childhood, and one day she would use them to save his grandson's throne. She set herself to the task, for she was above all a girl who applied herself. She learned the language until it was her own, and in the end she would speak and write and rule in French, as though she had been born to it, though there were those who never quite let her forget where she came from. She learned the country, its provinces, and its great families, the tangled web of loyalties and grudges and marriages that held the kingdom together and forever threatened to pull it apart. She learned the court, its factions and its silences, who could be trusted and who could not. And she watched her father-in-law govern with that cold, patient skill of his. And though she cannot have loved the man, she learned much from him about how a kingdom is held. All of this was schooling of a kind more valuable than any her tutors in Castile had given her, and she was a diligent pupil. The gravity that had been in her as a child settled and deepened into something formidable. She was becoming, without anyone quite noticing, a woman of real weight. And she and Louis, the two grave children, grew up alongside each other and grew, against the odds, to be genuinely fond. Theirs became one of the close marriages of the age, and later, when the tests came, they would stand together in a way that royal couples seldom did. But before any of that, in the first stretch of the marriage, there was a long and anxious waiting, and it is a part of her story that is easy to pass over and ought not to be, because it was surely one of the quiet sorrows of her early life. For years, the marriage produced no living child, in an age when a royal wife's whole worth was measured in the heirs she gave, and when the peace between two kingdoms had been sealed precisely in the expectation of a shared bloodline. The failure of children to come, or to live, would have pressed upon her with a weight that is hard for us now to feel. She was young, and there was time. But time in such matters never feels like enough when the whole court is counting. When the children did begin to come, they came, and then too often they went. This is the plainest and hardest fact of medieval family life, and it fell upon queens no less than upon the poorest women in the land, and in some ways more heavily, for a queen's losses were public. Blanche bore, over the course of her marriage, a great many children, as many as a dozen by the counts that have come down to us. Though the records are not perfectly clear, and the exact number is one of those matters we should not pretend to know to the last. And of that great company of babies, a cruel share died, some at birth, some in the first days, some as small children. She buried more of her own children than she raised. We can set that down in a single sentence, and the sentence cannot hold what it was. Each of those small deaths was a grief entire, and she went through them one after another, as women of her age had to, and kept on, because there was no choice but to keep on, and because there was always the next hope, the next confinement, the next fragile life to be prayed over. And yet for all the graves, a good number of her children did live, and grew, and came in time to fill the world with the House of Castile and France joined in them. And it is worth naming what became of the ones who survived, for it measures the dynasty she founded almost single-handed. The son who mattered most, the boy born in 1214, would be king and saint both. But he was not the only one of her children to leave a mark upon the age. One of his brothers would hold the great county of Artois and die a soldier in the east. Another would rule the wide lands of Poitiers in the south and prove one of the steadiest princes of his generation. A third, the most restless and ambitious of them all, would carry the blood of Blanche far beyond France, seizing a crown in the south of Italy and founding a line of kings in a warm country his mother never saw. And among her daughters was one who would give herself so wholly to a life of prayer and charity that she too, like her royal brother, would come to be honoured by the Church as a holy woman. From the crowded, sorrowful nursery of Blanche of Castile came a saint, a king who was a saint, princes and a would-be dynasty of the south, and a blessed daughter, a harvest of survivors that would have been the pride of any mother in Christendom. It is a strange arithmetic, the medieval nursery, the living and the lost sitting side by side in the same tally, and we should not let the survivors erase the small graves, nor the graves darken the achievement of the survivors. Blanche lived both truths at once, as the women of her world all did, burying and bearing and burying again. And out of that long ordeal, she brought a family that would shape the map of Europe for generations. The fierce protectiveness that would mark her whole later life, the refusal to let her children out of her sight or her control, was surely rooted here, in this early schooling in how easily a child could slip away, and in the answering resolve that the ones who lived would be guarded with everything she had. It would be wrong to dwell on the sorrow of it beyond what is due, for she did not have the luxury of dwelling on it herself, and her life was far from only sorrowful. But it would be wrong, too, to hurry past it as though it did not mark her, for surely it did. The woman who would later be so fierce in the guarding of her children, so unwilling to let them out of her grip, so watchful over their bodies and their souls, was a woman who had learned in the hardest school exactly how easily a child could be taken. When at last, in the year 1214, she bore a son who lived and thrived, a boy who would be called Louis after his father, she had every reason to hold that child as though all the world depended upon him. She could not have known then that the entire world, or at least the whole kingdom, one day very nearly would. He would grow up to be a king, and more than a king, for the church would in time name him a saint, the only king of France ever to be so honoured. And the shaping of that extraordinary man would be in very large part his mother's work. But that lay far ahead. For now he was simply the longed-for son who had lived, and around his cradle, the anxious waiting of the early marriage at last gave way to something like settled hope. So the first stretch of her married life came slowly into a kind of calm. She was no longer the strange foreign girl of 12. She was a woman grown, a wife who had won her husband's love and a place of her own in a difficult court, a mother with a living heir and more children besides. She had learned France so thoroughly that she could pass near enough for one of its own daughters, though the shadow of her foreign birth never entirely left her, and would be thrown up against her again in the bitter years to come. She had watched a hard king govern, and had taken the lessons to heart. She was ready, though she did not know it, for the part that history was preparing for her. And the first summons to that larger part came not from within France at all, but from across the sea, out of the troubled kingdom of England, where a crisis was building that would draw her husband, and through him herself, into the very deepest waters of European affairs. That is exactly where we are going next. The kingdom of England in those years was ruled by Blanche's own uncle, her mother's brother, the monarch they called John. And John was a man who had contrived to make himself hated by very nearly everyone he ruled. He had lost the great French lands his family had held, the very lands that lay at the root of the long war between the two crowns. He had quarrelled bitterly with the Pope and brought an interdict down upon England, much as Philip had upon France. And above all, he had pressed and squeezed and cheated his own barons, the mighty lords of England, until they rose against him in fury and forced him to set his seal to a charter of liberties, meant to bind him to the law. But John had no intention of keeping to it, and no sooner was the ink dry than he wriggled free, and the kingdom fell into open war between the sovereign and his own nobility. The barons, having gone so far, could not now go back, and a rebel who has drawn his sword against his king must find another king, or hang. So the English rebels looked across the sea for a champion, and their eyes fell upon the heir of France, upon Louis, the husband of Blanche. The offer they made was a staggering one. They invited Louis to come over with an army, to take the throne of England for himself, and they justified it by his marriage, for through Blanche, a granddaughter of the old English king, Louis could be dressed up with a claim to the English crown. It was a thin enough claim in law, but law was not really the point. The point was that the barons wanted rid of John and wanted a strong man to lead them. And Louis was strong and near at hand and married to a woman with English royal blood. Here, then, was a prize almost beyond imagining, laid at the feet of the House of France, the very crown of England, offered up by England's own lords. And yet, when it came to it, the old king Philip Augustus, that cautious and calculating man, hung back. He would not openly commit the resources of France to so wild and dangerous a venture, so far across the water, against a crowned and anointed king, with the Pope now swinging round to John's side. He gave his son quiet encouragement and little else, and left the boy to find the means himself. And it is here, in this gap, in this hesitation of the old king, that Blanche steps for the first time onto the great stage of history in her own right, and shows the world what she is made of. For where Philip wavered, Blanche did not. The venture was her husband's, and she threw herself into it with a fierce driving energy that astonished those who watched. It was she, as much as anyone, who set about raising the men and the money and above all the ships that the invasion of an island kingdom would require. She went to the ports of the north coast. She pressed the great men for their contributions. She gathered a fleet where her father-in-law would not, and she did it with a determination that brooked no refusal. There is a story that has come down to us from those days, and like several of the best stories about Blanche, we should tell it with a little caution, for it may be more than half legend, sharpened in the retelling to make a point. But the point it makes is a true one about her character, and so it is worth the telling. It was said that when the money ran short and men counselled caution, Blanche declared that she would pledge her very children, that she would give up her own sons as hostages and sell all that she had, rather than let her husband's great cause founder for want of funds. Picture the work of it, for it was not a matter of a single grand declaration, but of weeks and months of hard, unglamorous labour, the kind that history usually leaves out because it does not make a stirring tale. To send an army across the sea to conquer an island kingdom, a woman needed ships, and ships had to be found or built or hired, and sailors to man them, and money to pay for all of it. And the money did not come easily when the old king would not open the royal coffers. So Blanche went to the ports of the northern coast, the busy salt-smelling harbours, where the fishing boats and the trading vessels crowded the quays. And she dealt with the hard-headed men who owned the ships and knew exactly what a queen in need was worth to them. She pressed the mighty lords for their contributions, and shamed the reluctant, and rewarded the willing. She turned her own resources into coin, and her coin into timber and canvas and iron and men. It was the labour of a quartermaster and a treasurer, a recruiting officer all at once, and she did it. And slowly, along the grey northern shore, a fleet took shape upon the water, where before there had been only the will of one determined woman. There is something in that image that catches at the imagination. The young wife of the heir of France, standing on a windy quay among the tar and the rope and the shouting of sailors, willing an invasion into being by main force. It was not the work a queen was expected to do. Queens were expected to pray for their husbands and bear their children and grace their courts, not to raise war fleets while the King of France looked the other way. But Blanche had never been content to be only what was expected, and in the raising of that fleet she showed the world, for the first time on an immense scale, the thing that would define her, an energy and a nerve and a refusal to be beaten that could bend circumstances to her purpose. The ships were built and gathered and made ready, and when they at last put out from the harbours with the army aboard, they carried not only her husband's ambition, but the proof of her own extraordinary power to make things happen. Whether she said those exact words we cannot know, and it is honest to admit it. But that such a thing was said of her, and believed, tells us how she was seen. Here was no meek foreign wife waiting quietly for her husband to return. Here was a woman who, when the men of France dithered, took the entire enormous business of a war upon her own shoulders and drove it forward by sheer force of will. The fleet was gathered, the army was assembled, and in the year 1216, Louis crossed the narrow sea with his host and landed upon the shore of England, and marched, and was received in the city of London itself, and was proclaimed there, in the heart of the kingdom, as England's king. For a strange and dizzying moment, it seemed that the impossible feat had been done, that the House of France, through the marriage of Blanche of Castile, was about to wear the crown of England, and that the two ancient enemies were to be joined under a single ruler after all, though not in any way that anyone had foreseen. Much of the south and east of England fell to him. The great castles opened their gates. It hung there. For a season, tantalizingly within reach. Let yourself feel how astonishing that moment was, and how nearly the whole history of two nations turned another way. Here was a French prince, the husband of a Castilian princess, received into the very heart of London, the capital of England, and hailed there as the rightful king by the great men of the land. Had it held, had the wheel not turned, the crowns of France and England might have come to rest, within a generation or two, upon a single head, and the lengthy centuries of war between the two countries that lay ahead, all the famous battles and sieges and bitter enmity yet to come, might never have happened at all, or might have happened in some wholly unrecognizable shape. It is one of those hinges on which all the after-history of the world seems for a moment to balance, and she who had raised the fleet that carried it there had every reason, in that season, to believe that her husband was about to become the greatest ruler in the West. But a matter that hangs within reach is not a thing possessed, and the higher the hope had climbed, the further it had to fall. The English lords who had opened their gates to Louis had done so out of hatred for their own king, not out of love for a foreign prince, and such a foundation is treacherous ground to build a throne upon. The whole enterprise rested on the continuing usefulness of Louis to men whose true loyalties lay elsewhere, and the moment that usefulness ended, the ground would open beneath him. That moment was closer than anyone in London yet knew. And when it came, it would come not through any deed of Blanche's or her husband's, but through the death of the very man whose tyranny had summoned them across the sea in the first place. The wheel was already turning. The season of hope was almost over. And then it slipped away, as such matters so often do, undone not by any single defeat, but by the turning of fortune's wheel and the death of one man. That is exactly where we are going next. For the great adventure that Blanche had launched with such fire was about to fail, and the failing of it would be its own hard lesson. The one man whose death changed everything was John himself. In the autumn of the year, with Louis established in London and the rebellion at its height, the hated English king fell ill on campaign and died, worn out and beaten and cursing. And his death, which might have seemed to open the last door to Louis, in fact slammed it shut. For John dead was a very different thing from John alive. The great grievance of the English barons had been the monarch himself, his cruelty and his faithlessness, and now the sovereign was gone, and in his place stood his son, a boy of 9, an innocent child who had done no wrong to anyone. The barons had risen to be rid of a tyrant. They had not truly wished to hand their country to a foreign prince, and many of them had only ever turned to Louis for want of any other champion. Now there was another. The boy king, young Henry, was crowned in haste, and around him gathered the great men who had stayed loyal, and the charter that John had broken was reissued in the child's name, so that the very thing the rebels had fought for was now offered by the boy's own side. One by one the English lords began to slip away from Louis and back to their natural allegiance, to the child of their own royal house. The ground was going out from under the entire enterprise. 2 great blows finished it. The first came on land, at the city of Lincoln, where the forces loyal to the boy king fell upon Louis's army in the streets below the castle and broke it utterly, in a rout so complete and so profitable to the victors that they laughed about it afterward and gave it a mocking name. The second came at sea, off the coast, where a French fleet bringing reinforcements and supplies across the water, the lifeline of the whole invasion, was met and destroyed. The commander of that relief fleet was a notorious figure, a renegade churchman turned sea captain of fearsome reputation, and he was taken and killed, and with the fleet went the last hope of the venture. Louis, hemmed in and cut off, his allies melting away, his army beaten on land, and his ships lost at sea, had no choice left but to come to terms. He gave up his claim, took what money and dignity he could salvage from the wreck, and sailed home to France with nothing but his life and the hard knowledge of how close he had come. The crown of England, which had glittered so briefly within the reach of Blanche's husband, was gone, and it would never come so near again. Consider what it was to be Blanche in the wake of all that. She had thrown her entire heart and a great part of her fortune into her husband's cause. She had done what the old cautious king would not: raised the fleet, driven the venture forward, believed in it when believing was hard, and it had come to nothing, or worse than nothing, for it had cost dearly in men and money and pride. There is no record of her breaking under it. No sign that she reproached herself or fell into despair. What we see instead, reading between the sparse lines, is a woman who took the blow, absorbed it, and went on, holding the household steady, keeping her husband's spirits from sinking too low, turning her face toward whatever came next. It is one of the marks of the truly formidable that they can back a vast gamble, lose it, and neither be destroyed by the loss, nor learn from it the wrong lesson of never daring again. Blanche had dared greatly and lost. She would dare again when the need came, and the next time she would not lose. The English adventure was a defeat, but it was the making of her reputation. Everyone now knew that the wife of the heir of France was a woman to be reckoned with, a woman of iron will and boundless energy. And that knowledge would matter enormously in the seasons to come, when she stood alone. For that season were coming closer now. The old King Philip Augustus, who had reigned so long and so shrewdly, and built France up from a weak and quarrelsome thing into the strongest kingdom of the West, was growing old at last, and in the year 1223 he died. And with his death, in a single stroke, Blanche's husband ceased to be the waiting heir and became the monarch. Louis VIII and Blanche of Castile, the girl who had been fetched from Spain to seal a bargain, was a queen crowned. That is exactly where we are going next, to the brief bright reign in which she stood at last, at the very summit of the kingdom, no longer the heir's wife, but the sovereign's. Sharing in the rule of France, they were crowned together, husband and wife, king and queen, in the great tradition of the French monarchy. And Louis, freed at last from the long shadow of his careful father, threw himself into kingship with an energy that earned him his lasting name. They called him the Lion, Louis the Lion, for he was a fighter, restless and bold. Forever in the saddle and forever on campaign, determined to press the advantages his father had so patiently accumulated. His reign was short, only 3 years, but it was crowded. And through the whole of it, Blanche was no ornament at his side, but a true partner in the work of rule. She had spent more than 20 years now learning France from the inside, and she knew its business as well as any counsellor in the kingdom. When Louis rode off to war, as he constantly did, it was Blanche who held the centre, who kept the machinery of government turning, who watched over their children and guarded the heart of the realm while the king was away at its edges. She was, in these years, serving an apprenticeship for the far greater task that fate was quietly preparing for her, though neither she nor anyone else yet knew how soon it would come, nor how heavy it would be. There is a particular satisfaction, we may imagine, in that crowning for Blanche, whatever the labours it brought. She had come to France, a child of 12, to be the wife of a boy who was only the heir, the next thing, the one who waited. For more than 2 decades, she had lived in the antechamber of power, close to it, learning it, but never quite holding it. always the daughter-in-law, the heir's wife, subject to the cold authority of the old king. Now the old king was in his grave and the waiting was over. She and Louis were the monarch and queen of France in their own right, anointed and crowned in the ancient way. And the kingdom that Philip Augustus had built with such patient cunning was theirs to rule. For a woman of her gifts, so long kept in the second rank, the sheer scope of it, the reach and the responsibility, must have answered something deep in her nature. She had been made for this. And at last she had it, and she used it well in the way that suited the marriage they had made. Theirs was a true partnership, unusual in an age when a queen was so often merely a decoration or a womb, and Louis, who knew his wife's quality better than anyone, leaned upon her without hesitation. When he was in the saddle, which was most of the time, she was the still centre at Paris, the hand on the machinery of government, the guardian of their children and their cause. The kingdom grew used, in those 3 short years, to the sight of a queen who governed in fact, not only in name whenever the sovereign was away. And that habit, that acceptance of Blanche as a real wielder of power, was worth more than anyone could have guessed. For when the blow fell, when Louis was suddenly gone and a child sat on the throne, the kingdom already knew that his widow could rule, because it had watched her do it. The apprenticeship was not wasted. It was the very thing that would let her save everything. The great business of Louis's short reign, the matter that would carry him away to the south, and in the end carry him to his death, was the long and bloody affair of the war in the lands of the Midi, the war that history remembers as the Albigensian Crusade. It is a grim chapter, and we need not go far into its horrors on an evening meant for rest. But its shape must be sketched, for it is the road along which Louis went to his end. Far to the south of Paris, in the warm, rich country of the Languedoc, a form of the Christian faith had taken root that the Church of Rome held to be heresy, a grave and dangerous error. And for a generation now, the North had been waging holy war upon the South to stamp it out. It had been a savage business, marked by massacres and burnings, and the slow grinding conquest of one of the most cultured regions of Europe by armies from the north who came in the name of God and stayed for the land. By Louis's time, the worst of it was done, but the settlement was not yet complete, and the crown of France saw, in the exhausted, war-torn Midi, a great prize waiting to be gathered in. So in the last summer of his life, the lion took the cross and rode for the Midi at the head of an army, to bring the lengthy war to its conclusion and to bind the southern lands at last to the French crown. He went down into that hot, bright country so unlike his own, a country of olive and vine and walled towns baking under a fierce sun, and he made war, and he took the submission of the great southern city that had held out longest. And it seemed that he would finish the work and return home in triumph, having added the whole of the south to the inheritance of his young son. The territory he rode into was a world apart from the grey north he had left, and it is worth pausing there, in that bright, hard southern land, because it is the country where Blanche's fortunes would be so violently overturned. The Languedoc lay under a fierce sun, a region of stony hills and silver-green olive groves, of walled towns baking on their heights, of a tongue and a culture and a way of life older and in some ways finer than anything the northern conquerors possessed. It had been the most brilliant region of France, a place of poets and learning and ease, and a generation of holy war had left it scarred and sullen, its towns stormed, its people cowed, its heretics hunted, and over all of it the resentment of the conquered smouldering, like a fire banked under ash. Into this, the lion came at the head of his northern host, another army from the north, and he pressed the war to its close, and took the surrender of the greatest of the southern strongholds, and looked, for a season, like the man who would finish what a generation of crusaders had begun. But the South had a way of destroying the men who came to master it, and not always by the sword. The heat of it, the strange fevers of its summers, the sickness that bred in the camps of armies, kept too long under that merciless sun, had killed many a northerner who came south expecting only the dangers of battle. It was this, and not any enemy, that was waiting for Louis in the bright country he had all but conquered. He had beaten every army sent against him. He had no reason to fear the men of the south any longer. And it was precisely then, with the work almost done and the triumph almost in his hands, that the invisible enemy took him. Blanche, in the north, held the kingdom, and waited for him and prayed for his safe return, as she had prayed through so many of his campaigns before. But this campaign was not like the others, and what it would send back to her at last was not a returning husband, but the news that would change the whole course of her life, and of her sons, and of France itself. That is exactly where we are going next. The work in the Midi was all but finished when the illness took him. It was the kind of sickness that runs through armies encamped too long in hot country. A wasting flux of the bowels, unglamorous and merciless, that has killed more soldiers across the centuries than any sword. It fell upon Louis on the long march home, and it did not let go. He was carried north as far as a place called Montpensier, in the high country of the Auvergne, and there, far from Paris and far from Blanche, it became plain that the lion was dying. He was not yet 40. He had been king for barely 3 years, and he lay in a chamber in a strange castle in the middle of France, gathering the great men who were with him around his bed, and using the last of his strength to try to secure the future of the child he was leaving behind. For that was the terror of it, the matter that would have pressed upon a dying king harder than his own death. His heir was a boy of 12. A kingdom passing to a child was a kingdom laid open to every ambitious lord and every old grievance. A standing invitation to civil war. Louis knew it, and with his last clear hours he set about doing what he could. He gathered the barons who were present and had them swear a solemn oath, then and there at his bedside, that they would see his son crowned king, that they would uphold the boy and be faithful to him. It was a dying man's attempt to bind the living to his child by the most sacred promise he could exact. And then, having done what he could, Louis VIII, the Lion, died in the autumn of the year 1226. On the road home from a war he had all but won, and the news of it went speeding north toward Paris, toward the Queen, who did not yet know that she had become, in a single afternoon, a widow and the mother of a boy king in a kingdom full of wolves. Let the scene of it settle for a moment, that chamber in the strange castle in the high country of the Auvergne. So far from everything the dying king loved, he had ridden out at the head of an army with his entire life still before him, not yet 40, a crowned king, barely 3 years on his throne. And now he was ebbing away in a borrowed room among men who were his companions of war rather than his family, with his wife hundreds of miles to the north and his children further still. There is a particular loneliness in the death of the powerful, away from home, stripped in the end of all the apparatus of majesty, reduced to a man in a bed, fighting a losing fight against his own failing body. And through the fog of it, Louis held to the one thing that mattered, the safety of his boy, and spent what little strength remained to him, not on his own soul, though he was a devout man, but on binding those around him to protect his son. It was the act of a good father as much as a good king, and it was almost the last thing he did. And all the while, unknowing, Blanche went about her days in the north, tending the kingdom, watching the children, waiting as she had waited through so many of her husband's absences for the messenger who would bring word that he was safe and coming home. The cruelty of it is that she could do nothing, could not be there, could not hold his hand or hear his last words or say her own farewell, because the distances of that age were so great and the roads so slow that by the time any word could reach her, the thing would already be long done. Somewhere on the road between the Auvergne and Paris, a rider was carrying the news that would end one life of hers and begin another, and she did not yet know he was coming. When he arrived, everything she had would be laid, in an instant, upon her own shoulders, and the entire future of France would hang upon what this newly widowed woman did in the hours that followed. We do not know how the word reached her or what she did in the first hour of knowing. We know only what she did in the hours and days that followed, and it is one of the most impressive things in her whole impressive life. A lesser woman, and it would have been no shame, might have been undone by such a blow. She had lost the husband she had grown up beside and grown to love, the partner of 26 years, and she had lost him suddenly and far away, with no chance to be at his side or to say goodbye. She was in that moment entitled to her grief. But she was not entitled to indulge it, and she knew it, for she understood as clearly as her dying husband had that the whole safety of her son and her son's crown hung upon the next few days, and that if she faltered, even for a little while, the kingdom might be lost before the boy ever wore the crown at all. And so Blanche of Castile did what the truly formidable do. She set her grief aside, unlooked at, to be taken up later when there was time, and she acted. That is exactly where we are going next, into the swiftest and most decisive passage of her entire life. The days in which she saved her son's throne before his rivals even understood that it was in play. The danger was not imagined. A boy of 12 upon the throne meant that for years the real power would lie with whoever governed in his name, and the powerful lords of France, many of them proud and half-tamed, and nursing old resentments against the crown that Philip Augustus had humbled, looked upon the situation and saw opportunity. Some doubted whether a woman, and a foreign-born woman at that, had any business ruling France even for a season. There were those who muttered the old poison, that she was a Spaniard, an outsider, that the kingdom should not be left in the hands of a woman from over the mountains. The whole edifice that Blanche's late husband and his father before him had built was suddenly balanced upon a child and his mother, and there were plenty of men measuring it for a fall. Blanche moved faster than any of them. The heart of the matter was the coronation, for a king who has been anointed and crowned is a wholly different thing. In the eyes of that deeply religious age, from a mere boy who is next in line. The anointing was held to change the very nature of the man, to set the sacred oil of kingship upon him and make him God's chosen. So that to rise against a crowned king was not merely rebellion, but something close to blasphemy. Blanche understood this perfectly, and she was determined that her son should be crowned and anointed before any of his rivals could gather themselves to prevent it. So she gave them no time. Within a matter of weeks of her husband's death, before the great malcontents could so much as agree among themselves what to do, she had the boy brought to the ancient coronation city, to Reims, where the kings of France had been crowned for centuries. And there, in that vast grey cathedral, in the closing weeks of the year 1226, her son was anointed and crowned as Louis, the ninth of that name, King of France. Picture the scene in the great church, for it is a moment worth holding. The cathedral rising up into shadow overhead, cold with the coming of the harder season, filled with the smoke of candles and the sound of chanting. A boy of 12, small and grave, carried through the ancient rite the sacred oil set upon him. The heavy crown lowered onto a child's head, the regalia of 1,000 years pressed into his young hands. And behind him, watchful, upright, newly widowed and dressed, no doubt in her mourning, his mother, who had brought him to this place at such speed and against such odds, and who understood better than anyone present exactly what the ceremony meant and exactly how much still stood against them. For the crowning was a victory and an immense one, but it was only the first move. The boy was king now, truly and sacredly king, and that could not be undone. But he was still a child, and the real struggle, the long struggle to hold the kingdom together against the men who would tear it apart, was only beginning. And it would be fought not by the crowned boy, but by his mother, who now took up, with the same iron will she had shown in every crisis of her life. The government of France, consider the sheer speed and daring of what she had done in those few weeks, for it is easy to say the word coronation and pass on, and miss the nerve it took. Her husband had died far away in the south. The news had to reach her, the body had to be dealt with, the grief had to be swallowed, and a boy of 12 had to be gathered up and carried the length of the kingdom to the coronation city. All before the mighty lords who wished her ill could organize themselves to stop it. Every one of those lords understood, as well as she did, what an anointed king meant, and more than one of them would gladly have delayed the crowning, or seized the boy on the road, or set some other arrangement in motion that left the real power in their own hands. Blanche gave them no opening. She moved with a decision that left them flat-footed, and by the time they had worked out what to do, she had already done it, and the matter was beyond undoing. The boy was anointed, the sacred oil was on him. He was the Lord's anointed king of France, and no baron in the land, however mighty, could lawfully raise his hand against that. It was, in its way, the single most important act of her whole regency, this swift and ruthless securing of the crown before the opposition could form, and it set the pattern for everything that followed. Again and again in the years to come, she would win not by having greater force than her enemies, for often she did not, but by moving faster and thinking further ahead, by understanding the board more clearly and acting on that understanding without hesitation or self-doubt. The men against her were used to a slower game, and to opponents who could be bullied or bought or worn down. They were not used to a widow who struck first and struck cleanly and never let them recover the initiative. In the cold grey cathedral at Reims, with her husband barely in his grave, Blanche of Castile served notice on the entire kingdom of exactly the kind of ruler she intended to be, and the wisest of her enemies must have felt, even in that hour of the crown descending on a child's head, the first cold touch of the knowledge that they had badly underestimated her. The men who meant to profit from a boy king did not wait long to show themselves. They were among the greatest lords in France, and their names ran through the whole tangled web of the kingdom's noble houses. Foremost among them was the lord of the far western duchy of Brittany, a clever and slippery prince named Peter, a man so given to changing sides and breaking faith that history would fasten upon him a mocking byname, meaning the bad cleric. For he had once been meant for the church and had kept its cunning while shedding its scruples. With him, at one time or another, stood the Count of Boulogne, a half-brother of the late king himself, a man with royal blood and royal ambitions of his own, and a shifting company of other great magnates, some drawn in by grievance, some by greed, some merely by the ancient reflex of the over-mighty subject who cannot bear to see the crown grow strong. What they had in common was the calculation that a woman and a child could be pushed, frightened, and in the end dominated, and that the years of a royal minority were the season in which a bold lord might claw back all that the old kings had taken from his kind. They plotted, they gathered their strength, they intrigued with the enemies of France abroad, and above all, they schemed to get the person of the young monarch into their own hands, for whoever held the boy would hold the kingdom, and could rule in his name while pretending to protect him. This was the true danger, and Blanche saw it with perfect clarity. To lose control of her son to a faction of the barons would be to lose everything, for they would keep the outward show of loyalty while stripping her of all real power and governing France as they pleased behind the child's back. And so the great struggle of her regency became, at bottom, a struggle over the body of a boy, a long, dangerous contest of marches and countermarches, of castles seized and relieved, of alliances made and broken, in which the Queen Mother matched herself against the combined cunning of the mightiest men in the land. There is one moment from those early perilous days that has come down to us more vividly than the rest, and it deserves to be told, for it shows both the reality of the danger and the extraordinary bond that had already formed between this queen and the ordinary people of her son's kingdom. The young king had been away from Paris, and as he was travelling back toward the safety of the capital, word came that the rebel lords were massing in arms along the route, meaning to intercept the boy and seize him upon the road. The king's escort was too small to fight its way through. He was caught, in effect, in open country, with hostile forces gathering between himself and home near a place called Montelary, where an old castle stood guard over the road south of Paris. It was exactly the kind of trap the barons had been laying, and for a moment it seemed it might close. What happened next was not the work of soldiers, but of the common people. When it became known in Paris and in the towns and villages of the surrounding country that the boy sovereign, the boy their late master had commended to them with his dying breath, was in danger on the road, the people rose. They came out, we are told, in their thousands ordinary men and women of the Ile de France, armed with whatever they had, and they lined the roadsides and filled the way and formed a living wall of bodies about their boy king, and so escorted him, mile by mile, in a great moving press of common folk, safely back to Paris and out of the reach of the lords who had meant to take him. The great magnates, with all their knights and their castles, could do nothing against the sheer weight of a people who had decided that this child was theirs and would not be touched. It is one of the most moving scenes in all the history of the French monarchy, and it tells us something that no list of battles could. Blanche's cause and her son's was not merely the cause of a faction. It had taken root in the affections of the ordinary folk of France, who saw in the widowed queen and her fatherless boy something worth protecting, and who would come out into the road to protect it. That reservoir of common goodwill, carefully never squandered, was one of the great hidden strengths of her regency, and the arrogant lords who despised it never understood how much it cost them. It is worth asking why the ordinary people of France should have loved a foreign-born queen and her half-grown son so fiercely that they would take to the roads to defend them. And the answer tells us something about the entire nature of Blanche's rule. The mighty lords offered the common folk nothing but the old miseries of feudal war, the burnt fields and the plundered barns, and the arrogance of armed men who took what they pleased. The crown, for all its faults, offered the promise of order, of a single high justice above the squabbling of the barons, of a peace in which a man might plough and reap and keep what he grew. When the people looked at the widowed queen holding the kingdom together against the overmighty, they saw not a foreigner, but a protector, the guardian of the settled peace their late king had promised them, and they were not wrong to see it so. Blanche understood, as the proud lords never troubled to, that the affection of the many was a kind of power, quieter than castles and knights, but in its own way stronger, and she tended it carefully all her life, and it repaid her in the hour of need. And so the boy came safe to Paris on that day, carried home not by an army, but by the love of a populace. And the lords who had meant to seize him were left to gnash their teeth at the sight of a whole countryside risen to thwart them. It was a lesson, none of them ever quite absorbed, that they were fighting not merely a woman and a child, but the settled affection of a kingdom, and that every time they moved against the crown, they drove that affection deeper and made their own cause more hopeless. The road from that day led, slowly and by many turns, to the breaking of their whole rebellion, and though there would be much hard work still to do, The sight of the common people forming a living wall about their boy king was a sign, for anyone with the eyes to read it, of how the lengthy struggle was going to end. Yet goodwill alone does not govern a kingdom, and the crowd that saved the boy at Montlhéry could not be summoned every day. The long work of the regency was harder and less glorious than any single dramatic rescue. It was the patient, grinding, unending business of holding a vast kingdom together against men who wanted it in pieces, and it fell almost entirely upon the shoulders of one woman. Blanche had loyal counsellors, churchmen, and officials who served the crown faithfully, and she leaned upon them, but the driving will was hers. It was she who decided, she who commanded, she who rode out when riding out was needed, and negotiated when negotiation would serve better. She showed in these years that the reputation she had won in the English adventure had been no accident. She was tireless, she was fearless, and she had a strategist's grasp of the whole board, of when to strike and when to wait, of how to turn one enemy against another, of how to make her few advantages count for more than the many advantages of the men against her. The barons had numbers and castles and the arrogance of ancient blood. Blanche had the crowned king, the loyalty of the towns, the machinery of a state that two strong kings had built, and a mind as cold and clear in a crisis as any that ever governed France. It would prove to be enough. But the proving of it took years, and the method by which she at last broke the Great Rebellion was not, in the main, the method of war. It was something subtler, and it is exactly where we are going next. Blanche understood a truth that escapes the merely warlike, which is that a coalition of proud and ambitious men is a fragile thing, held together only so long as each of them believes he will gain more by standing with the others than by breaking away. Loosen that belief in even one of them, and the entire alliance begins to come apart at the seams. So she made herself a mistress of the art of division. She watched the rebel lords not as a single enemy, but as a company of rivals who trusted one another, no further than they could see, and she worked patiently upon their jealousies and their fears and their appetites, drawing one away with a concession, buying another with a marriage or a grant of land, frightening a third with a show of force at exactly the moment his nerve was weakest. Where a blunter ruler would have tried to smash the rebellion in one great battle and very likely lost, Blanche picked it apart, lord by lord, so that the mighty confederation that had looked so terrible in its first gathering slowly dissolved into a handful of isolated malcontents who could be dealt with one at a time. It was governance as a kind of patient chess, and she played it better than any of the men ranged against her. The breaking of that great rebellion was not, for all her cunning at the council table, a bloodless business, and it would give a false picture to leave the impression that it was. There were seasons of hard campaigning in it, of armed men upon the roads and castles besieged and relieved, of the Queen herself moving with the royal power to overawe a wavering lord, or to lift the pressure from a loyal town. When the slippery Prince of Brittany defied her, she carried the war into his own country and made him feel the weight of the crown. When the lands of her friends were threatened, she moved to shield them. She summoned the levies of the monarchy. She paid for soldiers out of the treasury she guarded so jealously, and she showed, when showing was needed, that behind all her patience lay a hard readiness to fight. It was the combination that made her so nearly unbeatable. The negotiator and the commander joined in one person. The woman who would far rather divide her enemies than crush them, and yet was perfectly willing to crush them if dividing should fail. The lords who had imagined that a widow and a boy would be easy prey discovered instead that they faced a ruler who could outthink them where the maps were spread and outmarch them where the roads ran, and who never, in either place, was seen to lose her nerve. The rebels did not fight alone, for they looked, as rebels in France so often did, across the water for a foreign ally, and they found one in the young ruler of England, the very boy in whose name Blanche's own husband had once been driven out of that island. He was grown now, and hungry to win back the lands his father had lost, and he threw in his lot with the malcontent lords, and even brought an army across the sea to make their cause his own. It might have been a grave danger. In the event it came to remarkably little, for the English king was no great soldier, and his allies were divided among themselves, and Blanche was more than a match for the whole loose combination. The expedition achieved almost nothing, and drifted home again. And the Queen had faced down not only the mightiest lords of France, but the meddling of a foreign crown besides, and had come through it with her son's throne more secure than before. It was as complete a vindication as she could have asked for, and it was noticed, after that, fewer and fewer men were willing to wager their lands and their lives against her. Into this long game came one of the strangest and most talked of threads of her entire story, and it is one we must handle with a careful hand, because more nonsense has been written about it than about almost anything else in her life. Among the mighty lords of France was Theobald, the Count of the rich province of Champagne, a man quite unlike the hard-fighting barons around him. Theobald was a poet, one of the finest of the age, a maker of songs in the courtly manner, a man of cultivation and sentiment as much as of arms, and his loyalties throughout these years were famously changeable, now leaning to the rebels, now swinging back to the crown. And there grew up, in his own time and ever more luxuriantly afterward, a persistent tale that the reason for his wavering, the secret spring of his conduct, was that the Count of Champagne was hopelessly and helplessly in love with the Queen. It was said that he wrote his most beautiful songs for her, that he was smitten with the widowed Blanche, older than he though she was, and that he could deny her nothing when it came to it, and that this hidden passion drew him again and again back to her side against his own worldly interest. It is a wonderful story, and we should enjoy it for what it is, which is very largely a story. There is little in the way of solid evidence that any such love affair existed in fact, and a great deal of reason to think it grew in the telling, as gossip about a powerful woman always grows, half out of genuine court rumour and half out of the eternal human wish to explain a woman's political success by way of a man's desire for her. Blanche's enemies certainly whispered such matters, for it was an easy and a dirty way to diminish her, to hint that a woman who outmanoeuvred the greatest lords in France must have done it not by wit, but by wiles, and later ages. Charmed by the image of the poet count sighing after the austere queen, kept the tale alive for its own sweetness. What we can say soberly is this: Theobald of Champagne did, in the end, come over to the crown and prove a valuable friend to Blanche's cause, and his defection from the ranks of the rebels was one of the blows that helped bring all the coalition down. Whether he did it out of love, or out of the cold calculation that his interests lay with the winning side, or out of some mixture of the two that he himself could not have untangled, no one now can say. The Queen, for her part, gives us no sign that she was anything other than a widow entirely devoted to the memory of her husband and the future of her son. But the rumour clung to her, as rumours cling, and it is part of her story whether she willed it or not. What is not rumour, what is solid and lovely and quite real, is the poetry itself, for Theobald of Champagne was one of the finest makers of songs that the age produced, and his verses have outlived every treaty and every battle of those years. He wrote in the courtly manner of longing and devotion and the sweet suffering of a love that reaches always upward towards something it cannot quite attain. And whether or not any particular song was truly meant for the Queen, the entire body of his work breathes the atmosphere of a world in which a high-born lady might be the distant object of a poet's whole heart. It is easy to see how the legend grew, How later readers, turning over his songs of unreachable love, and knowing that this same count had wavered so strangely in his loyalties toward the queen, put the two things together and made of them a romance. Perhaps they were right to. Perhaps a man may write his politics and his passion into the same lines without ever quite separating them himself. We cannot climb inside a heart 8 centuries cold and read what was truly written there. What we can say is that Theobald, poet and prince and turncoat, and if the tale is true, hopeless admirer of the queen, made his peace with the crown in the end, and threw his weight behind Blanche when it counted, and that his coming over was one more strand cut from the rope the rebels had hoped to hang her with. Whether he did it for a woman's sake or his own, the effect was the same. And Blanche, who never in her life let sentiment stand in the way of statecraft, took the advantage he offered and asked no questions about his motives. If a great lord wished to imagine himself in love with her and to serve her cause the better for it, she was far too clever to disabuse him. She had a kingdom to save, and she would use every tool that came to her hand, including, it may be, the devotion of a lovesick poet who happened also to be one of the mightiest men in France. What matters, beneath the romance, is that the strategy worked. By patience, by division, by the timely use of force and the timelier use of a concession, by binding the towns and the church and the ordinary people to the crown, while peeling the powerful lords away from one another, Blanche wore the rebellion down until there was nothing left of it. The bad cleric of Brittany, that most slippery of her enemies, was brought at last to heel and made to submit. The Count of Boulogne, with his royal blood, came to nothing. One by one the storms of the early regency blew themselves out against the immovable fact of a queen who would not be frightened and would not be beaten and would not, above all, let go of her son or her son's crown. By the time the growing boy was approaching the age when he might begin to rule in his own right, the kingdom his father had left, balanced upon a knife's edge, had been made safe again. Its overmighty subjects humbled, its crown as strong as ever it had been under the old kings. And it had been done by a woman ruling in the name of a boy, against the odds and against the sneers. In one of the most quietly remarkable feats of statecraft the medieval world can show. She had promised nobody that she could do it. She had simply done it, day after grinding day, until it was done. And yet the barons were not the only great trouble that Blanche inherited and had to bring to rest. Away to the south, the old wound of the crusade against the heretics still lay open. The war that had killed her husband, not by the sword, but by the sickness of the camp. That war too had to be ended, and ended in a way that would gather its bitter fruit into the hands of the French crown rather than let it slip away. And the settling of it would show a different side of Blanche's skill. The patient diplomacy of the treaty table rather than the hard suppression of a revolt. That is exactly where we are going next. The war in the south had dragged on for a generation, and by the time it fell to Blanche to end it, both sides were exhausted. The great southern lord, who still held out, worn down by years of grinding pressure, and the crown eager to gather in at last the rich lands over which so much blood had been spilt. Blanche saw that the moment for a settlement had come, and she pursued it not as a conqueror dictating terms from horseback, but as a stateswoman securing a lasting gain by agreement. The result was a treaty, sealed in the closing years of the 1220s. That brought the long crusade formally to its end and bound the great southern county to the French crown in a way that no battle could have done so securely. The heart of the bargain was a marriage, the daughter and heiress of the defeated. Southern lord was betrothed to one of Blanche's own younger sons, so that in time the whole vast inheritance of the south would pass, through that marriage, into the hands of the royal house of France. It was a masterstroke of the patient dynastic art at which Blanche excelled, for it turned a war that might have ended in nothing but ruin and resentment into a permanent enlargement of the kingdom, achieved by the joining of two families rather than the mere crushing of one. The lands that the armies of the north had failed to hold by force were secured for France by a wedding ring, and the credit for that far-sighted settlement belongs in large part to the Queen who governed in her son's name. The settling of the south was more than a matter between the crown and a beaten count, for the entire long war had been the Church's war, preached and blessed and driven on from Rome, and any peace had to be made with the Church looking over the shoulder of everyone at the table. Here Blanche walked a careful line, for she was as devout a daughter of Rome as ever lived. And yet she was also the guardian of a crown whose interests did not always march in step with the papacy's. She wished the heresy suppressed and the faith made safe, as any pious ruler of her age would. But she wished, quite as much, to see the great southern lands bound to France, rather than left as a private preserve of the Church or a standing battlefield for zealots. And it was the crown's advantage that her settlement served in the end, that she could satisfy both her conscience and her kingdom at a single stroke, closing a holy war on terms that enlarged the realm without ever setting herself against the Church she loved, is one more sign of the deftness that ran through all her statecraft. It is worth pausing to take the measure of what she had done by this point, for it is easy to let the events run past without feeling their weight. Within a very few years of being widowed, a foreign-born woman ruling for a boy had faced down the greatest rebellion of the age and dissolved it, had held the loyalty of the towns and the common people, had kept her son safe through every plot to seize him, and had brought the ruinous Southern War to a close on terms that made France larger and stronger than it had ever been. There were kings with long reigns and full treasuries and armies at their backs who accomplished less. And she had done it while carrying, all the while, the private griefs that no chronicle records, the loss of her husband, the loss of so many of her children, the loneliness of a woman who could truly confide in no one because she could afford to show weakness to no one. The gravity that had been in her since childhood had become something like granite. She was not, by all accounts, a warm or an easy woman to those around her. She was demanding, exacting, sometimes harsh, and she made enemies who never forgave her. But she was, by any fair reckoning, one of the great rulers of her century, and the kingdom she handed on was the proof of it. Try, before we go further, to see the figure herself at the height of her power. For the chronicles give us a glimpse or two. She was tall, by report, and had carried the good looks of her youth well into her middle age. An upright and commanding presence, who wore the dignity of her rank as though she had been born wearing it, which of course she had. Yet it was never her appearance that men remembered when they had dealt with her. It was the force of her, the sense of a will that did not bend, and a mind that let nothing slip past. Those who came before her found her courteous, and found her also immovable. A ruler who would hear an argument to its very end, and then do precisely the thing she had already judged to be right. She could be gracious to the few she trusted and cold as iron to those who crossed her. And she had a tongue that could set an over-mighty lord back on his heels without ever once being raised. A foreigner by birth and a woman in a world built for men, she governed one of the greatest realms of the age for the better part of 3 decades. And in all that time, no one ever mastered her. That is the figure to keep before the mind through the rest of this story. Not a holy king's mother, standing in the shadows of his legend, but a sovereign in her own right. The equal in craft and nerve of any crowned man of her century. Not every trouble of that season was a matter of high politics. Some were closer to home, and one of them touched a world that was only then being born, the world of the schools of Paris. For the city on the river had become, in these very years, the greatest centre of learning in all of Christendom, drawing scholars and students by the thousand from every corner of Europe to study in what was becoming the University of Paris. A new kind of institution that would shape the mind of the West for centuries. But a vast crowd of young scholars, foreign, boisterous, and jealous of their liberties, was a combustible thing, and in one season, a quarrel that began in a tavern over a matter as small as a bill for wine flared into rioting in the streets. And the townsfolk and the officers of the crown answered the disorder with a heavy hand, and some of the students were killed. The scholars, outraged, did the matter that made a medieval university so strange and so powerful. They simply left. They dispersed, teachers and students together, scattering to other towns and other lands, and threatened never to return. And for a time it seemed that Paris might lose the very jewel that was making it famous. Here again Blanche's government had to find its way through a delicate business, balancing the crown's authority and the anger of the townsfolk against the enormous value, in prestige and in wealth, of the university whose scholars had fled. It was not a crisis of armies but of privileges and grievances and wounded pride, and it dragged on and was patched up and flared again. And its final settling belonged as much to the church and the monarch grown older as to Blanche herself. But it belongs in her story as a reminder that the queen who could break a baronial revolt and end a crusade also had to govern. Day by day, a living kingdom full of ordinary frictions, a kingdom of quarrelsome scholars and touchy townsmen, and clergy jealous of their rights, and that the patience and judgment she brought to the great crises she brought also to the small ones. A ruler is made as much by the handling of 100 lesser matters as by the meeting of a few great ones, and Blanche handled them year upon year with a steadiness that never seemed to flag beneath the great crises. The truest work of her rule was the quiet and ceaseless labour of administration, and here too she proved the worthy pupil of the shrewd old king whose court had schooled her. She held the officers of the crown to their duty, watched over the royal revenues, saw that the sovereign's justice ran in the distant provinces, and guarded with a miser's care every right and every scrap of authority that the monarchy had gathered to itself. She grasped, as the proud barons never did, that a kingdom is held not only in the pitched battle and the sworn treaty, but in the daily grind of accounts and appointments and judgments, in the thousand small decisions that either strengthen a crown or let it quietly bleed away. Nothing was too small for her notice if it touched the power of the throne she was keeping in trust for her son. It was unglamorous work, the kind that leaves little mark in the chronicles, which have always preferred their battles and their scandals. And it was exactly this work, carried on without a break through the long stretch of her regency, that made the France she handed back so much sturdier than the one she had taken up. Through all of it, one purpose ran deeper than any other and outlasted every crisis, and that was the raising of her son. For while Blanche governed France, she was also, and to her own mind above all, forming the boy who would one day take the kingdom back into his own hands. And the man she made of him would prove to be the most remarkable king that France, in all its long line of kings, would ever produce. The shaping of that man was the truest work of her life. Deeper than any treaty and more lasting than any victory, and it is exactly where we are going next. From the moment her son had lived, and all the more from the moment his father died and left him a crowned child in her keeping, Blanche had poured into the boy the whole force of her formidable character. She was, first and last, a woman of deep and demanding piety, and it was piety above every worldly thing that she set herself to plant in him. She oversaw his religious education with a rigour that left nothing to chance, choosing his teachers and his confessors, seeing that he learned his devotions and kept his fasts, and understood from the earliest age he could understand anything, that a king was answerable before God for every soul in his kingdom and for his own soul most of all. She taught him that to be a king was not a license, but a burden, a trust to be discharged with justice and mercy, and above all, with a clean conscience. And the lesson took so deeply that it became all the shape of the man. The boy she raised would grow into a king who dispensed justice under an oak tree to the humblest of his subjects, who washed the feet of the poor, who gave until his counselors despaired of him, who held himself to a standard of personal holiness so severe that the Church, within a generation of his death, would proclaim him a saint. And the root of all of it was the mother who had knelt him down to his prayers and would accept nothing less than the best that was in him. There is a saying that has come down to us as the very distillation of Blanche's love for her son. And though we should remember that such sayings are often polished and reshaped in the retelling, and cannot always be taken as her exact words, this one has been repeated for so many centuries because it captures so perfectly the woman we meet everywhere else in her story. It was said that Blanche told her son, when he was still a boy, that she loved him as dearly as a mother could possibly love her child, but that she would rather, far rather, see him lying dead at her feet than know that he had committed a single mortal sin. Sit with that for a moment, for it is a fearsome thing for a mother to say, and a fearsome thing for a child to hear. And it tells us everything about the iron at the centre of her tenderness. This was no soft or doting love. It was an affection that cared for the boy's eternal soul above his very life, that would rather lose him to the grave than to damnation. And it was under the weight of a tenderness like that, exacting and absolute, and never satisfied with less than holiness, that the future saint was formed. Whether or not she said those precise words, she lived by them, and her son grew up knowing it, and it made him what he was. The daily texture of that upbringing is worth dwelling on, for it was under Blanche's hand relentless in a way that would astonish a gentler age. She saw to it that her son heard Mass and said his offices, that he learned his letters and his scripture, that he was schooled not only in the arts a king must know, the riding and the arms and the law, but above all, in the examination of his own conscience. He was taught to fear sin more than he feared any earthly enemy, to see the poor as Christ in disguise, to hold his own comfort cheap and his own soul dear. Much of this the boy took so deeply into himself that it became his nature rather than his discipline. So that as a grown king, he would fast and pray and give alms and sit in judgment with a scrupulous fairness that amazed those around him, and would treat the meanest beggar with a courtesy he did not always trouble to show to princes. The man the world would revere was, in a very real sense, a work made by his mother, shaped year upon year by her demanding and untiring care, until the shape held of itself. There was a hardness in it, and we should not pretend otherwise, for a childhood spent under so exacting a love is not an easy thing, and there must have been in the boy, as there is in every child so raised, a portion of fear mixed in with the devotion. But the extraordinary result was that the fear did not curdle into resentment. Whatever the weight of his mother's expectations, her son grew up loving her without reserve and honouring her judgment above all others. And the holiness she had drilled into him became the truest joy of his life rather than its burden. It is a rare thing that a child formed so severely should turn out so whole, and it speaks both to the depth of Blanche's love beneath the severity and to the native sweetness of the boy's own character. Between them, the iron mother and the gentle son, they produced something the medieval world had never quite seen before. A king who was genuinely, unfeignedly good, and the world would remember him for it long after the treaties and the battles were forgotten. She was, in truth, a difficult and overwhelming presence to grow up beneath, and it would be idle to pretend otherwise. The same iron will that saved his throne pressed hard upon the boy himself and upon everyone around him. She kept him close, watched him narrowly, governed not only the kingdom, but the entire texture of his young life, his hours, his companions, his conscience. For a child, and later for a young man, it must at times have been almost suffocating. This mother, who could not, or would not, loosen her grip, who had fought too hard and lost too much to trust the boy's safety or his soul to anyone but herself. And yet the extraordinary thing is that it did not break him or turn him against her. He loved and revered her to the end of her life and beyond it. And though he grew into a man of powerful character in his own right, fully her equal in strength of will, he never ceased to honour her or to lean upon her judgment. The bond between this mother and this son is one of the great relationships of medieval history, fierce and deep, and not without its shadows. And the man it produced was the crown of Blanche's whole life's work. For consider what she had made. She had taken a fatherless boy and a kingdom in peril, and holding both together with her own hands through years of danger, she had raised the one and secured the other, and delivered to France, when the time came. Not merely a surviving king, but a great one, a king whose reign would be remembered as a golden age, whose justice would become a legend, and whose holiness would set him among the saints. Kings are shaped by many hands, and it would be too much to say that Blanche alone made her son what he was, for there was in him a native goodness that was his own. But no one who reads their story can doubt that the deepest mark upon him was hers, that the severe and luminous piety by which the world would remember him was first lit at his mother's knee, and that the France he would rule so justly had been held in trust for him, through its darkest passage, by her tireless and unyielding love. In shaping him, she shaped the age, and it is no small thing to say of any life that its truest monument was another human being. But Blanche's devotion did not spend itself only upon her son. It reached outward and upward into the building of houses for God, into the endowment of prayer, and the making of quiet places where the religious life she so revered could be lived out on her behalf, and for the good of her soul and the souls of those she had loved and lost. Away from the council chamber and the crises of state, there was another Blanche, the Blanche of the cloister and the chapel. And to understand her fully, we must follow her there, into the white and silent world of the abbeys she raised. That is exactly where we are going next. The religious houses that Blanche loved best belonged to the Cistercians, that austere and reforming order of monks and nuns whose whole way of life was a rebuke to worldly show. Where older monasteries had grown rich and comfortable, decked with gold and colour, the Cistercians had turned deliberately back toward simplicity, toward plain, unpainted stone and undyed wool, toward hard work and long silence, and the bare beauty of a whitewashed church with the light falling clean through clear glass. Their abbeys rose in quiet valleys, away from the noise of towns, and were built to a spare and lovely plainness that matched the severity of their rule. And it was this vision of the holy existence, stripped of everything soft and superfluous, that spoke most deeply to a woman as demanding of herself as Blanche was of everyone else. In the austerity of the Cistercians, she found the outward form of her own inward faith, and she resolved to bring such houses into being, to endow them with lands and treasure, and to make of them a lasting gift to God and a refuge for her own soul. The greatest of her foundations rose near the town of Pontoise, not far from Paris, a house of Cistercian nuns, to which she gave the name of the Royal, for it was the Queen's own abbey, built at her command and paid for from her own purse, and it became the place dearest to her in all the world. The exact reckoning of its beginnings, the precise season in which the first stones were laid, has come down to us a little uncertainly, as the founding dates of such houses often do, and it is honest to hold the details loosely. But the substance is clear. Blanche raised there a whole community of women given over to prayer, and she watched over it with a founder's tender care, and she meant from the first that it should be the place where she herself would one day be laid to rest. among the nuns whose life of quiet devotion she so admired. She endowed a second house as well, another Cistercian foundation, this one lying nearer to the town of Melun to the south, and to it too she gave her care and her wealth, so that the two abbeys stood as twin monuments to her faith, the visible sign of a piety that ran beneath all her hard statecraft, like an underground river beneath a fortress. Step for a moment into the kind of place she made, for it is a world away from the council chamber and the battlefield, and it is where her heart truly lived. A Cistercian church was a study in the beauty of restraint, its walls washed plain, its windows filled with clear glass rather than the jewelled colours of the older churches, so that the light came in, unstained, and lay in long clean panels across the stone floor. There were no gilded shrines, no painted saints crowding the walls, nothing to distract the eye from the bare loveliness of proportion and light and silence. The nuns rose in the small hours to sing the first office of the night, and returned again and again through the round of the sun to their prayers, their voices rising in the plain song that was the one permitted ornament of that austere life, unaccompanied, unhurried, filling the tall space with a sound like the breathing of the building itself. Between the offices there was work and there was silence, the two great disciplines of the order, and over it all lay a peace so deep and so deliberately made that a visitor from the clamour of the world might feel it settle on the shoulders like a weight lifted rather than laid on. This was the atmosphere Blanche loved above every luxury the world could offer her, and it tells us as much about her as any of her deeds of state. The woman who could break a rebellion and stare down the greatest lords in France wanted, for her own soul, not splendour but plainness, not the roar of triumph but the hush of the cloister, not to be served but to kneel among women who had given up everything to pray. She poured her wealth into these houses, not to buy herself glory, but to buy, in a sense, a place of quiet at the still centre of a loud and violent life. A place where prayer would go up for her, and for her dead, and for the son she loved beyond her own soul, long after she herself was gone. And she meant, from the first, that one of these houses should receive her body at the last, that when all the battles were over, she would lie down among the plain white walls and the clean light and the singing, and rest. There is no better key to the whole of her than this, that the hardest ruler of her age longed, underneath it all, only for the peace of a silent church. We should not imagine that this devotion was a matter apart from the rest of her, a soft private corner in an otherwise ruthless public life. It was, on the contrary, the very centre of her, the source from which everything else flowed. The same conviction that made her rather see her son dead than sinful, the same absolute seriousness about the matters of God and the soul, drove both her governance and her building. She fasted and prayed with a rigour that impressed even the devout age she lived in. She gave generously to the poor and cared in the medieval royal manner for the sick and the wretched, seeing in such works not sentiment but duty, the discharging of the trust that God had laid upon the great. And she carried into her religion the same uncompromising standard she carried into everything, so that her piety, like her rule, could be severe, exacting, and hard to live up to, and yet was wholly sincere. The true bedrock of her whole formidable character. When at last her long life drew toward its close, it was to the Cistercians she would turn. And it was in the plain white world she had built that she would choose to die and to lie. And there is a deep fittingness in that which we shall come to in its time. For now, though, she was still a woman, very much in the world. And the world had a way of bringing her fresh trials, even in the seasons that ought to have been her most contented. As her son grew toward manhood, and the great crises of the regency subsided, the ordinary business of a royal life went on, and chief among that business, for a king approaching the age to rule, was marriage. A king must have a queen and must have heirs. And so a bride had to be found for the young Louis, and in the finding and the aftermath of it, we meet a Blanche who is a little harder to admire. The Blanche of the possessive mother who could not bear to yield her son to another woman. It is a very human failing in a woman, otherwise so far above the common run, and it makes her, if anything, more real to us. And it is exactly where we are going next. The bride chosen for the young monarch was a daughter of the Count of the southern land of Provence, a girl named Margaret, and by every account she was gracious, intelligent, and well suited to be a queen. And the marriage, made when Louis was a young man, grew into a genuinely loving one. Louis and Margaret came to care deeply for each other, and in the ordinary course of things, a mother might have rejoiced to see her son so well and so happily matched. Blanche did not rejoice. Having held her son so close for so long, having governed his every hour since he was a boy, she found she could not loosen her grip even now, even for a wife. And there grew up between the queen mother and the younger queen a coolness that hardened, in the telling, into something like open rivalry for the heart and the loyalty of the king, who stood between them. The stories that have come down to us of this jealousy are vivid, and they are worth repeating with the caution they deserve. For our fullest source for them was written down long afterward by a man who knew the monarch in his later years and set down what he had heard. And such recollections, however charming, are anecdote rather than record, and may well have grown in the telling. Still, they paint a picture too characterful to leave out. It was said that Blanche did everything she could to keep the young husband and wife apart, contriving that they should be lodged and occupied separately so that the loving couple could find little time together. And there is a tale, famous ever since, that the two of them took to meeting in secret upon a spiral stair that ran between their chambers on different floors, where they might snatch a few private moments together while their servants kept watch. And that when the servants saw the Queen Mother approaching, they would rap upon the door in warning, so that the sovereign might scramble back up or down to his own room before his mother caught him with his own wife. Whether the tale is true in its particulars, or has been sweetened by time, it captures a real and rather touching truth, that even the most powerful young king in Christendom and his queen had to hide from his mother to be together, and that Blanche's love, for all its greatness, had in it a streak of possessiveness that could not let go. We need not judge her too harshly for it. This one flaw in so strong a woman. She had given her entire life to her son. She had saved his throne, shaped his soul, held a kingdom together for his sake, and buried a husband and very many children along the way. And this boy who had lived and thrived and become a king was, in a sense, the entire harvest of her long labour and her long grief. That she could not easily share him, that she clung to him even against his wife, is a failing born of the very depth of her devotion, and it is the kind of failing that makes a great figure human. Louis, for his part, honoured his mother to the end, while learning slowly to be his own man and his wife's husband, as well as his mother's son, and the household found its balance in time, as households do. But the shadow of that rivalry between the two queens is part of the truth of Blanche, and to leave it out would be to gild her. And she was too real and too remarkable to need gilding. There is a sadness underneath the famous stories of the stair and the warning knock, and it is worth naming plainly. For it is the sadness of a woman who had never learned how to stop. Everything that made Blanche formidable, the fierce protectiveness, the refusal to trust her son's safety to anyone, the will that would not bend, had been forged in years of real danger when the boy's very life and crown had hung upon her vigilance. Those years were over. The danger had passed. The boy was a grown king with a good wife and a secure throne, and the watchfulness that had once saved him was no longer needed and had nowhere useful to go, and so it curdled a little, turned inward, became the jealousy of a mother who could not believe the fight was truly won, and could not hand her son over even to his own happiness. It is the common tragedy of those who have carried others through great peril, that they do not always know how to lay the burden down when the peril is past. And Blanche, for all her greatness, did not entirely know how. Yet the marriage survived her, and thrived, and that is its own kind of verdict. Louis and Margaret went on to a long and loving union, and a house full of children, and the young queen, whatever she suffered from her mother-in-law in the early years, outlived the old queen and came into her own at last. And Blanche and her son were never truly divided by any of it, for the bond between them was deeper than any quarrel over a daughter-in-law could reach. The rivalry was real, and it was a flaw, and it caused real unhappiness in its day. But it sat inside a love so vast and so proven that it could not finally be damaged by it. And when the end came, and the news of the mother's death reached the son across the sea, there was no trace left of any coldness between them, only a grief that laid the great king low. As the boy king came fully into his manhood, there dawned upon the kingdom a rare and precious thing, a long stretch of settled peace, and it is worth lingering in it a while, before the shadows gather again. For it was in some ways the happiest passage of Blanche's whole life. The great rebellions had been mastered, the Southern War had been closed, the crown stood strong and respected, and the boy she had guarded through every danger had grown into a king whom his people were coming to love, and whom she could, at last, trust to hold the reins. She did not vanish from government when her son came of age, for that was not in her nature, and he did not wish it. Rather, she moved from the front of the stage to a place just behind the throne, remaining his closest counsellor, the voice he trusted above all others, the partner of his rule as she had once been the partner of his father's. Mother and son governed France now almost as one, and they governed it well. And for a season the kingdom knew the blessing of a strong crown, a just king, and a wise old queen behind him. And there was little for the chroniclers to record, but the quiet business of a land at peace. It is easy to pass quickly over such a calm, for a settled peace makes poorer reading than a rebellion. And yet that calm was the whole point of everything that had gone before it. All that Blanche had fought for came, in this season, to its harvest. The roads were safe again for the merchant and the pilgrim. The fields were tilled without the dread of the burning that civil war brings down upon the poor. The king's justice reached even the humblest of his subjects, and the monarch himself, the man she had made out of a frightened boy, sat among his people, dealing out that justice with a fairness that was already passing into legend while he still lived. It was, by the hard measure of that century, something very like a golden age, and it had been bought with the toil and the grief of the woman who now stood, content at last, a little way behind the throne. She had come a very long road from the dusty courtyard in Castile, where an old woman had once picked her out of a line of sisters, and she had arrived, in this quiet season, at the far end of it, with the very thing she had been chosen to protect standing whole and bright in front of her. And her son filled those quiet seasons with the works of the faith she had planted in him. He gathered to his capital the most precious relics that Christendom could offer, treasures of the Passion carried at vast cost across the sea from the east. And to house them, he raised in the heart of Paris a chapel of such soaring and jewelled beauty that it seemed less a building than a lantern made of coloured light. He founded hospitals and houses for the poor and the blind. He sat in judgment beneath the open trees where any subject might come to him, and he made of his court a place where holiness was not merely permitted, but was the very temper of the age. Blanche, watching, must have known that all of it flowed from the hard schooling she had given a small boy long before, the fasts and the prayers and the fierce insistence that a king answers to God above every earthly thing. The most beautiful and most devout reign that France would ever know was at its root her own handiwork, and she lived to watch it come into flower. Picture what those settled years must have felt like to her. After all she had come through, a woman who had been a stranger, fetched over the mountains as a child, who had waited long and grieved often, who had thrown herself into a vast gamble and lost it, who had been widowed in an afternoon and had fought for years to save her son's throne against the mightiest men in the land, could look about her at last and see the harvest of it all standing safe. Her son was a king, grown, admired, and secure. The kingdom was whole and strong. The abbeys she had founded were rising or risen, their bells marking out the offices, their communities of nuns at their prayers. Grandchildren came in time to fill the royal nurseries, and Blanche, who had buried so many of her own babies, could watch a new generation of the house she had preserved grow up in a France she had helped to make safe for them. She was aging now, and the fierce energy of her prime was banked down into the steadier authority of an old queen, but her mind was as clear and her judgment as sound as ever. And she was honoured throughout the kingdom, as few women in that age were ever honoured, as the mother of the sovereign and the saviour of the realm. It would be pleasant to be able to say that she was allowed to end her days in that hard-won calm, but history rarely grants its great figures so gentle a close. And Blanche's story had one more great trial waiting in it, one more time when all the weight of France would be laid upon her old shoulders. The source of it was the very piety she had planted so deep in her son, for the king she had raised to holiness, conceived in the fullness of his devotion, a burning desire to go on crusade, to take the cross and sail to the distant east, to fight for the faith in the Holy Land, as his ancestors had done. It was the highest expression of everything she had taught him, and it was also, from a mother's and a stateswoman's point of view, something close to a catastrophe, for it meant that the monarch would leave his kingdom for years, would hazard his life in a far and dangerous country, and would leave France once again to be governed in his absence. And there was only one person to whom he could entrust it. That is exactly where we are going next. When the sovereign took his vow to go upon crusade, Blanche is said to have grieved as deeply as at any moment since the death of her husband, for she understood, as perhaps the monarch in his ardour did not, how great the danger was, and how likely it was that he would never return. She had spent her whole life keeping this son safe, guarding his body and his throne against every enemy, and now he was resolved to carry both across the sea into the teeth of a war in a distant land, and there was nothing her authority or her love could do to prevent it. For his conscience was set, and a conscience she herself had forged. She did not, in the end, try to hold him back from what he believed God required of him, whatever it cost her to let him go. But she asked, and he granted, that the governing of France, in his absence, should be placed once again in her hands. And so, in her advancing years, when most women of her age who had survived so long were left to the quiet of their households, Blanche of Castile took up for a second time the entire burden of ruling the greatest kingdom of the West. The king made his preparations, gathered his host and his fleet, set his affairs in order, and at length the season of parting came. He went down to the coast to take ship for the east, and his mother went with him as far as she could, and there upon the shore, the two of them, who had been so much to each other for so long, said the farewell that both of them must have feared would be their last. We are not told the words that passed between them, and it is right that we are not, for some matters are too private even for the chroniclers, but we may let ourselves feel the weight of that leave-taking, an old queen of 60 and more, watching the son she had saved as a boy set sail into the unknown, knowing in her heart that she might well not live to see him come home, and that even if she lived, the sea and the sword and the sickness of foreign camps might take him from her forever. The ships stood out from the harbour, their sails filling, and grew small and were gone over the rim of the sea, and Blanche turned back to a kingdom that was once more hers to hold, and to the lengthy, uncertain wait for word from a son who had passed beyond her reach at last. It was the beginning of the final chapter of her life, and she did not know, as she rode away from that coast, that she was never going to see her son's face again in this world. There is a weight to that parting that grows heavier the longer you hold it. All her life Blanche had fought to keep this son within the circle of her protection. She had crowned him as a boy before his enemies could seize him, guarded his body through every plot, shaped his soul with her own hands, and even, in his manhood, been unable to loosen her grip enough to give him freely to his wife. And now she had to stand upon a shore and let him sail away entirely beyond her reach, into a war in a distant land from which the great majority of those who went never came home, and she could do nothing, nothing at all, to keep him safe. The whole art of her life had been the imposing of her will upon circumstance, and here at last was a circumstance no will could touch. She could govern his kingdom for him. She could not sail with him, could not guard him there, could not stand between him and the sword or the fever or the sea. She could only let him go and turn back and wait. And the waiting she now faced was of the cruelest kind, the waiting of a mother for word of a son in mortal danger, far away, stretched across the vast, slow distances of that age, when a message might take months to travel and might, when it came, be the worst news in the world. She would govern France superbly in the seasons that followed, as we shall see, but underneath the governing there ran always this other thing, this constant low dread, this listening for the messenger from the east. Every rider who came to court might be carrying the word that her son was dead or captured or lost at sea. She had lived through the sudden death of a husband far from home. She knew exactly how such news arrived, and how little warning it gave. And she carried that knowledge with her through every one of the days that were left to her, ruling a kingdom with a steady hand, while her heart was always, in truth, out upon the water, following a ship she could no longer see. The second regency was in many ways harder than the first, for Blanche undertook it as an old woman whose strength was no longer what it had been, and the troubles it brought were of a stranger and more unsettling kind than the plain baronial ambition she had mastered in her prime. The kingdom she now governed was quieter at its summit, the mighty lords long since brought to heel. But the years of her son's absence stirred up disorders from below that were harder to grasp and harder to answer. Chief among them was a wild and frightening movement that swept up out of the countryside, a great rising of the common poor that history remembers by the name of the shepherds. For it began among the herdsmen and the humble folk of the fields. It started, as such things often did, in a kind of religious fervour, a mass longing among the poor to do something for the crusade and for the sovereign across the sea. And it gathered to itself an immense disordered multitude following a mysterious preacher who promised them that God had chosen the simple and the lowly to accomplish what the mighty had failed to do. At first Blanche, moved perhaps by the piety at the root of it, and by her sympathy for her absent son's cause, looked upon the movement with a certain favour, and even received its leader, and hoped that this surge of common devotion might be turned to good. But a vast crowd of the poor, roused up and leaderless and drunk on the sense of their own holiness, is a dangerous thing. And this one soon turned from devotion to violence, falling upon the clergy, spreading disorder and bloodshed across the land, until it became plain that what had begun in fervour had become a menace to the very peace of the kingdom. Blanche, seeing clearly at last what she was dealing with, turned against the movement with all the decision of her younger years, withdrew her favour, and set the authorities to breaking it up, and broken up it duly was, its leader killed, its multitudes scattered. the danger dispersed. It was a lesson, if she had needed one, in how quickly the temper of a whole people could catch fire in her son's absence, and how heavily the keeping of the peace rested upon her alone. What strikes one most about this second regency is that Blanche took it up at all. She was past 60, an age that in that century made her genuinely old, a woman who had already given the whole of her strength to France, not once but many times over, in the raising of a fleet, in the saving of a throne, in the breaking of a rebellion, in the ending of a war, in the shaping of a king. She had every claim, by any reasonable measure, to the quiet of her abbeys and the rest she had so richly earned. Instead, when her son asked it of her, she shouldered the entire weight of the kingdom again and carried it through years of his absence, and dealt with everything those years threw at her, the risings and the disorders and the endless ordinary business of rule, with the same clear-eyed competence she had brought to it as a younger woman. There is a kind of greatness that shows itself not in the single dramatic feat, but in the refusal ever to lay the burden down, the willingness to be, to the very last of one's strength, the one who holds matters together so that others may be safe. And Blanche had that greatness in full. And she governed, in those final years, not as a caretaker marking time until the king's return, but as a true sovereign making real decisions and standing by them. She kept the peace, defended the crown's rights, restrained the powerful, and looked to the welfare of the humble, all while carrying the private dread that gnawed at her through every silence from the east. It was a masterly performance, and it is one of the reasons that those who have looked closely at her life have come to rank her among the great rulers of the medieval world rather than merely among its notable queens. Twice the kingdom was placed wholly in her hands, and twice she held it faultlessly and gave it back stronger than she found it. Not many kings could say as much, and she was never, in the eyes of the law, a king at all. Only a woman doing a king's work, because there was no one else who could do it half so well. To feel the size of the burden she took up that second time, it helps to call to mind what a crusade was in that age, and what it cost the men who went. To sail for the East was to cross into a world of heat and thirst and unfamiliar sickness. To make war in a country that had swallowed northern armies whole, and to be, for seasons on end, wholly beyond the reach of home. Kings who went did not always come back, and those who did come back did not always come back whole in body or in mind. Blanche knew all of this, knew it more clearly than most, and it was against that knowledge that she governed France while her son was gone, holding the realm in trust through the long silence, shielding it from any who might read an absent king as an opening, and waiting, always waiting, for the word from overseas that might be a triumph or might be the end of everything. That she shouldered it at all, at her age, and after all she had already spent of herself, is remarkable. That she carried it so well, keeping the kingdom quiet, and the crown secure through the whole of her son's absence, is the last great proof of a strength that had never once failed the country that was not, by her birth, even her own. There were other trials in those final years of her rule, quieter but revealing, and one of them shows us the steel that was in her to the very end. A dispute arose between the crown and a body of the clergy over the treatment of certain humble people, serfs bound to the church, who were being used with a harshness that stirred Blanche's sense of justice. The details of the affair are recorded only in part, and we should not press them too far, but the shape of it is memorable, for it is said that the old queen, hearing that these poor bondsmen were being held and mistreated, intervened directly and forcefully on their behalf, setting the weight of the crown against the harshness of the churchmen, and this from a woman whose whole life had been one of the deepest reverence for the church. It tells us that her piety was never mere subservience, that her sense of what was just could override even her deference to the clergy, and that the fire that had faced down the barons in her prime still burned in her, banked but bright, in her last years upon the throne. She governed, in that second regency, as she had always governed, with justice, with decision, and with an unbending will, holding the kingdom steady and safe for a son who was far away and might never return, and asking of herself, as ever, nothing less than everything. But the everything she asked of herself was now being asked of a body that was wearing out. And the long labour of a life spent at the very centre of great events was drawing at last toward its close. Word came but rarely from the east, and when it came it was often grievous, for her son's crusade went hard, and there were times when she did not know whether he was alive or dead, or a prisoner in the hands of his enemies. To govern a kingdom is a heavy thing at any age. To govern it in old age, in constant dread for the life of the son who is the whole meaning of your own, waiting through the lengthy silences for news that may be the worst news of all, is a weight few could bear. And Blanche bore it as she had borne every other, without complaint and without faltering, until her strength gave out. And when it began to fail, it failed quickly, as the strength of the very old so often does. And she, who had outlasted so many storms, found herself facing the one storm that no will, however iron, has ever turned aside. That is exactly where we are going next, into the last passage of her long and extraordinary life. Her final illness came upon her, while her son was still overseas, still beyond the reach of any message that could bring him to her side in time, and she seems to have known, with the clear-eyed realism that had marked her entire lifetime, that she was dying. And in the manner of her dying we see, one last time, the deepest truth of who she was. For this queen, who had worn crowns and governed kingdoms, and matched herself against the greatest men of the age, chose to leave the world not as a queen, but as a nun. She asked to be received, at the very end, into the Cistercian order she had loved and served and enriched, and the plain habit of a religious was laid over the body of the ruler of France, so that she died clothed not in the robes of majesty, but in the simple undyed wool of a woman vowed to God. There is something almost unbearably fitting in it, that the austere and demanding faith which had been the bedrock of her whole life should be the last thing she reached for, that she should lay down the kingdom and the crown and take up, in their place, only the veil and the promise of a humble sister. She died in the closing weeks of the year 1252, an old woman far from the son she had loved beyond her own life, in the plain habit of a nun, having given, from the first to the last, absolutely everything she had. Let the quiet of that ending settle over you, for after so loud and crowded an existence, there is something almost tender in the smallness of its close. No battlefield, no council chamber, no crowd in the road, only a chamber, and the failing of an old woman's strength, and the plain wool of the habit laid over her, and the murmur of the offices going up around her from the sisters she had gathered. She had worn the crown of France and governed its whole vast machinery twice over, had matched herself against kings and popes and the mightiest lords of the age, and beaten them, and at the last she wanted none of it, only to be received as the humblest of the women who prayed, and to lay down every burden she had ever carried, and to be at peace. There is a lifetime's wisdom in that choosing, the understanding of a soul that had seen the very heights of earthly power and knew exactly how little they weighed against the thing she reached for at the end. The one sorrow that could not be mended was the absence of her son, and it is the shadow that falls across her deathbed and cannot be lifted. The two of them had been the fixed poles of each other's lives for 40 years. And now she was dying, and he was 1,000 miles away across the sea, and there was no possibility, none at all, of his coming to her, of a last word passing between them. of the hand she held since he was a boy closing once more around hers at the end. She died, knowing he could not come. He would live for months, not knowing she was gone. Of all the partings her life had asked of her, and it had asked many, this was the hardest and the last. And she met it as she had met everything, without flinching, giving up her spirit in the plain habit she had chosen. Far from the one face in all the world she would most have wished to see. There is an image in it that lingers after the rest has faded, of the great queen at the very end, laying aside the woman the world had feared, and taking up the woman she had always, underneath, most wished to be. The crowns and the councils and the long wars fell away from her, and what was left was a soul at the edge of the unknown, wrapped in plain, undyed wool, listening to the offices she had loved her entire life, rising about her in the plain song of her own sisters. She had spent herself to the very bottom, given every ounce of her strength to a country and a son, and now there was nothing left to give and nothing left to guard, and she could do at last the one thing her whole life had never once allowed her, which was simply to lay everything down. Somewhere far off, across the sea she had watched her son ride into. That son was still living, still fighting, still knowing nothing of his loss. And here, in a plain white room at the heart of the France she had saved, the queen who had held a kingdom together with her own two hands loosened her grip on it, and on everything, and passed quietly out of the world she had bent so long to her purpose. They laid her, as she had wished, in the royal abbey she had raised near Pontoise, among the Cistercian nuns whose life she had so revered, and her heart, by the custom of the age that allowed a great person to rest in more than one beloved place, was carried to the other house she had founded near Melun, so that in death she was given to both the quiet communities she had made. And there, in the plain white church beneath the clean northern light, the girl who had been fetched over the mountains from Castile more than 50 years before, and who had become the most formidable queen that France had known, was given at last to the earth and to the prayers of the sisters. Her long labour done, her long grief ended, her body come to rest in the very austerity she had loved. The kingdom she had twice saved went on without her, as kingdoms do, but it never quite forgot the woman who had held it together with her own hands through its darkest passage. Nor should we. The hardest part of the story, the part that stays with you longest, is what became of the son, for the monarch was still far away across the sea when his mother died, and the news of it had to travel all the slow distance from France to the east before it could reach him, and so for weeks, perhaps for months, Louis went about his business in a foreign land, not knowing that the woman who had given him everything was already gone from the world. When the word came to him at last, in that distant place, it broke him as nothing in all his hard crusade had broken him. This king, who had faced battle and defeat and captivity with the steady courage of his faith, was undone utterly by the death of his mother, and those who were with him recorded that he wept as they had never seen him weep, and shut himself away in his grief, and for a long while could not be comforted. He had known, surely, when he sailed, that he might never see her again, and yet the knowing had not softened the blow when it fell. She had been the fixed centre of his whole world since, before he could remember, the hand that had guarded him, and the will that had shaped him, and the love, fierce and exacting and boundless, that had never once failed him. And now she was gone, and he had not been there, and could not have been there, and would never see her face again. Across all the miles of sea, and all the long weeks of not knowing, the bond between this mother and this son held to the very last, and the measure of what she had been to him is written in the depth of the grief with which he mourned her. And so we come to the reckoning, to the question of how such a life should be remembered. And it is a question worth sitting with quietly as the evening draws in. For Blanche of Castile has not been remembered as she deserves. She has come down to us, when she has come down at all, chiefly as the mother of a saint, a supporting figure in her famous son's story, the stern parent behind the Holy King. And she was that, and it was a vast achievement to have been that. For the saint was in no small part her making, but she was so much more besides. She was a ruler in her own right, one of the ablest of her century, a woman who twice took up all the burden of the greatest kingdom in the West and carried it safely through peril that would have crushed a lesser soul. She faced down the mightiest lords in France and beat them, not with armies, but with patience and cunning and an unbreakable will. She held the loyalty of the common people so deeply that they came out into the roads in their thousands to shield her boy with their own bodies. She ended a ruinous war, enlarged and strengthened her adopted country, and handed on to her son a France stronger than the one she had inherited. And she did all of it as a foreigner, a woman, and for much of it, a widow alone. Against the sneers of men who thought a Spanish woman had no business ruling France, and she proved every one of them wrong. The histories that reduce her to somebody's mother have not looked at her closely enough. Look closely, and you see one of the great figures of the medieval world, formidable, flawed, devout, and utterly indomitable, a queen who gave her entire life to a kingdom that was not her own by birth, and made it, in the end, entirely hers. There is a thread in her story, worth drawing out at the very end, and it reaches all the way back to its beginning. To the aged queen on the mountain road. Eleanor of Aquitaine had crossed the Pyrenees at the close of her life to choose a granddaughter who would carry something forward, and whether or not she knew quite what she was choosing, she chose well beyond any reasonable hope. For in Blanche the qualities that had made Eleanor the wonder of her age came again, and in some respects came stronger. Tempered by a devotion Eleanor never had, and disciplined by a gravity that the pleasure-loving Duchess of the South would hardly have recognised. The girl fetched out of Castile grew into a woman who ruled more successfully than her famous grandmother ever had, who was never imprisoned, never set aside, never outmaneuvered, who held real power for decades and used it with a steadiness that Eleanor, for all her brilliance, could not always match. The old queen had reached down into a nursery for an heir to her own greatness, and the child she lifted out surpassed her. Her story belongs among a small company of medieval women who took up the power that was supposed to be a man's alone and wielded it as well as any of them, or better, and it is right to set her plainly in that company. Her own grandmother had been one such woman. So had a scattered handful of others down the centuries, queens and regents and great abbesses who found, in the gaps torn open by dead husbands and infant heirs, the space to show at last what was in them. Blanche stands tall even in that gathering, for few of them ever held so much for so long, or gave it back so nearly untouched. She had not asked to be a ruler. She had been carried over the mountains as a girl to be a wife and a mother, and it was only the blows of death, her husband's, and then the long absence of her son, that pressed the government of a whole kingdom into her hands. Yet when it came to her, she met it as though she had been fashioned for it from the first, which, in a manner of speaking, an old woman jolting south over the passes had once looked at a grave Spanish child and believed that she was, if she is less remembered than she has earned, part of the reason lies in the very completeness of her success. Failure makes a louder story than quiet mastery ever can. A queen who loses a throne, or dies upon a scaffold, or is driven into exile, leaves behind a tale that the centuries cannot help retelling. A queen who simply holds everything together, who meets each danger in turn, and defeats it and hands the kingdom on unbroken, leaves behind only the absence of catastrophe. And the absence of catastrophe is a hard thing for later eyes to see. Add to that the blazing fame of the son she raised, a canonized king whose light has thrown his mother into shade for 800 years. And it is small wonder that Blanche has been let slip toward the edges of the story she truly stands at the heart of. But the edges are the wrong place for her, and an evening spent like this one is a small effort to move her back toward the middle, where a woman who twice saved a kingdom and raised a saint has every right to stand. And the thread ran on past Blanche into her son, and past him into the entire after history of France. The kingdom she twice preserved did not fall into the hands of the barons who would have torn it apart. It passed whole and strong to the sovereign she had made, and through him to his heirs, and the France that would loom so large in the centuries to come. The great power at the heart of Europe was in a real and unglamorous sense, a thing that Blanche of Castile had kept alive through the years when it might so easily have died. She built no cathedrals that bear her name in the way kings' names are remembered. She won no battle that school children recite. Her monument is subtler and greater than any of those, for it is the survival of a kingdom and the character of a saint. And it is written not in stone, but in the whole shape of the history that came after her. That is a strange kind of immortality, quiet and almost invisible, and it is exactly the kind that would have suited she who wanted, at the last, only the plain wool of a nun and the silence of a white church. It is worth pausing on how easily the whole of it might have gone the other way, for the achievement looks inevitable only from a safe distance, and it was nothing of the kind while it was being made. A boy king in that century was very often the undoing of a dynasty. Minorities bred civil wars, and civil wars broke kingdoms. And there were realms enough in that age that slid into long anarchy for want of a strong hand when the old king died too soon. France did not, and the single reason it did not was the queen who stood between the child and the wolves. Take her out of the story, and it is not hard to imagine a very different one. Of a boy king seized and made a puppet on the knee of some great lord, of the crown's hard-won power leaking away into 100 baronial hands, of the strong France that Philip Augustus had built, dissolving back into the weak and quarrelsome thing it had been before him. That none of this came to pass was not luck. It was Blanche. I have kept back one small thing to say to you, now that we have come to the end of her story, and then I will let you go to your rest. The Blanche we have spent this evening with is a real woman, drawn as faithfully as the old records allow, and where those records grow uncertain, in the tales of a poet's love, or a mother's jealousy, or the exact words she spoke, I have tried to tell you honestly where the firm ground ends and the storytelling begins, because a life this remarkable does not need to be embroidered to be worth the telling. If you have found some peace in these few hours we have spent together, in the company of a queen the world half forgot, then you are always welcome to subscribe, so that another such evening can find its way quietly to you when it is ready, and carry you off to sleep some other time. There is nothing you need do, and no hurry in any of it. It is only there, if you should like it, whenever you care to return. And now the fire is low, and the story is told, and there is nothing left for this evening but to let it all go, the mountains and the abbeys, the child king and the crowd in the road, the old queen in her plain white habit at the last. Let it drift away like smoke, and let your thoughts grow slow and easy, and let yourself sink down at last into the rest you have earned. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.